When a billionaire's daughter moves into a struggling father's spare room, neither realizes they're connected by a deadly corporate secret that destroyed one family and could save countless others. Welcome to a story of hidden truths, unexpected family bonds, and the courage to choose justice over blood. Follow Daniel and Sophie's journey to the very end, and comment below with your city, so I can see how far this story has traveled across the world. The moving truck pulled away from 247 Maple Street, just as the first drops of October rain began to fall, leaving Daniel Cole standing on his front porch with a check for 3 months' rent clutched in his weathered hands. $600. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep the electricity on through Christmas and maybe, just maybe, buy Lila the art supplies she'd been asking for since school started. "Daddy, is the college girl really going to live with us?" 8-year-old Lila pressed her nose against the living room window, her breath fogging the glass, as she watched a slight figure struggle with an oversized duffel bag on the sidewalk. "Her name is Sophie, sweetheart. And yes, she's going to rent the spare room for a while." Daniel folded the check carefully and slipped it into his wallet next to the faded photograph of his late wife, Maria. 3 years. 3 years since the cancer had taken her, since the medical bills had consumed their savings, since his world had collapsed into this daily struggle to keep his head above water. The girl, Sophie Voss, according to the simple rental application she'd filled out in pencil, looked even younger than her stated 20 years as she hauled her belongings up the narrow walkway. No parents helping her move. No friends, just a quiet politeness and cash for the security deposit that she'd counted out in crisp bills as if she'd just visited the bank. "I'll help her," Daniel said more to himself than to Lila, and stepped out into the drizzle. "Let me get that for you," he called out, jogging down the steps. Up close, Sophie was smaller than he'd expected, maybe 5'4" in her worn sneakers with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and eyes the color of storm clouds. She wore jeans that had seen better days and an oversized sweater that looked like it came from a thrift store, but there was something about the way she carried herself, a quiet confidence that seemed at odds with her humble appearance. "Oh, thank you, Mr. Cole. That's very kind." Her voice was soft, educated, with just a hint of an accent he couldn't quite place. East Coast, maybe. Money definitely, though her clothes suggested otherwise. "Just Daniel is fine. And this is Lila." He gestured towards the window where his daughter had pressed her entire face against the glass, leaving a perfect imprint of her features. Sophie's face broke into the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "Hi, Lila. I like your butterfly pajamas." Lila giggled and waved, then disappeared from the window, presumably to run to the front door. "She's excited to have someone new around," Daniel explained, shouldering Sophie's surprisingly heavy bag. "It's been just the two of us for a while now." "I understand. My mom died when I was 12. The words came out matter-of-factly, but Daniel caught the slight tightening around her eyes. "It's hard raising a child alone. I'm sure you're doing wonderfully." The simple kindness in her voice hit him unexpectedly. Most people either avoided mentioning Maria altogether or offered empty platitudes about time healing all wounds. Sophie's quiet acknowledgement felt real genuine. "Thank you," he said simply. "That means more than you know." The front door burst open, and Lila came barreling out, her dark curls bouncing as she skidded to a stop in front of Sophie. "Are you really an art student? Daddy said you go to the college for art. Do you paint? Can you teach me to paint?" "I have crayons, but Daddy says real artists use paint and brushes and—" "Lila, breathe." Daniel laughed, setting down the duffel bag. "Let Sophie get settled in before you interrogate her about her entire life story." "It's okay," Sophie said, crouching down to Lila's eye level. I do study art, and I'd love to see your drawings sometime. Maybe we can make something together. Really? Lila's eyes went wide. Daddy, did you hear Sophie wants to see my drawings? I heard, kiddo. Now how about we help Sophie get her things inside before we all catch pneumonia out here? The next hour passed in a blur of boxes, bags, and Lila's non-stop chatter. Sophie's belongings were surprisingly minimal for a college student. A few changes of clothes, some art supplies, a laptop that looked like it had seen better days, and a small collection of books. No photos, no decorations, nothing personal, except for a delicate silver bracelet that she never took off and seemed to touch unconsciously whenever she was nervous. This is perfect, Sophie said, standing in the doorway of the small room that had once been Daniel's home office. It wasn't much, barely big enough for a twin bed, a desk, and a narrow dresser, but it was clean and had a window that looked out over the small backyard where Maria's rose bushes still bloomed each spring. The bathroom's just down the hall, and you're welcome to use the kitchen whenever you need to, Daniel said. Lila and I usually eat dinner around 6, and you're always welcome to join us, but no pressure. I know college students keep strange hours. Actually, I'd love to have dinner with you both if that's okay. I'm not much of a cook, but I can learn. Sophie set her laptop on the desk and turned to face them. I should probably mention I'm a pretty quiet tenant. I study a lot, and I don't really have friends over or anything like that. That's fine by us. We're pretty quiet ourselves. Daniel glanced at Lila, who was bouncing on her toes with barely contained excitement. Well, some of us are quieter than others. Can I show Sophie my room? Lila asked. And my art supplies, and my rock collection, and… How about we let Sophie get settled first? Daniel suggested. She's had a long day. No, it's really okay, Sophie said quickly. I'd love to see your room, Lila. And so began what Daniel would later recognize as the first crack in Sophie's carefully constructed facade. As Lila dragged her new housemate down the hall, chattering about her stuffed animals and her collection of smooth stones from the creek behind their house, Sophie's guard seemed to drop just a fraction. She listened with genuine interest as Lila explained the intricate backstory of each stuffed animal, and she examined every drawing in Lila's art folder with the seriousness of a museum curator. This one is beautiful, Sophie said, holding up a crayon drawing of 3 stick figures standing in front of a house. Who are they? That's me and Daddy and Mommy, Lila said matter-of-factly. Mommy's in heaven now, but I still draw her sometimes because Daddy says she's always with us. Daniel felt his throat tighten as he watched Sophie's face. For just a moment, her composed mask slipped entirely, and he saw something raw and vulnerable in her expression, a pain that mirrored his own. I think she'd love this picture, Sophie said softly. You're a very talented artist, Lila. Daddy says I get it from Mommy. She used to paint, but she had to stop when she got sick. Lila's voice took on the rehearsed quality of a child who had learned to talk about tragedy with the casual acceptance that adults seemed to prefer. Do you miss your mommy too? Every day, Sophie replied, and Daniel heard the absolute honesty in her voice. But you know what I've learned? The people we love never really leave us. They live on in all the ways they changed us, all the love they gave us. Lila nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to her 8-year-old mind. That's what Daddy says too. He says Mommy's love is like a warm blanket that we carry with us everywhere. Daniel had to turn away for a moment, overwhelmed by the simple wisdom of his daughter and the unexpected understanding from this virtual stranger who had just walked into their living. The first week passed more smoothly than Daniel had dared to hope. Sophie was exactly the kind of tenant he'd dreamed of, quiet, clean, and unfailingly polite. She paid her rent on time in cash again, which struck him as odd, but not alarming. kept common areas tidy, and somehow managed to win Lila over completely within the first 3 days. It started with small things. Sophie would emerge from her room each morning, just as Daniel was fighting the daily battle of getting Lila ready for school, and she'd quietly help by braiding Lila's hair or finding the missing homework folder that had inevitably vanished overnight. She never overstepped, never tried to replace Daniel's authority, but her presence made the chaotic morning routine feel suddenly manageable. "You don't have to do that," Daniel said one morning as Sophie packed an extra sandwich into Lila's lunchbox. "I know," Sophie replied, wrapping the sandwich in wax paper with the kind of precise care that suggested long practice. "But I want to. She's a special kid, Daniel. You're raising something really beautiful here." The way she said his name, not Mr. Cole, just Daniel, with a warmth that made it sound like they'd been friends for years, did something to his chest that he wasn't quite ready to examine too closely. It was on Friday of that first week that Daniel first noticed the contradictions. He'd come home from his shift at the auto parts store to find Sophie and Lila at the kitchen table working on what appeared to be an elaborate art project involving colored paper glue and an impressive array of supplies. "We're making origami cranes," Lila announced proudly, holding up a slightly lopsided paper bird. "Sophie knows how to make them perfect, but mine look like sick chickens." "They look like they have character," Sophie corrected gently. "Perfect is overrated anyway." Daniel examined the crane in Sophie's hands. It was indeed perfect, each fold crisp and precise, the proportions flawless. This wasn't the work of someone who'd learned origami from YouTube videos. This was the skill that came from years of practice, probably expensive lessons. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, settling into the chair beside them. "My mom taught me," Sophie said, but something flickered across her face as she said it. She said it was good for focus and patience. "How many are we making?" Daniel picked up a piece of paper and attempted to follow Sophie's patient instructions. 1,000, Lila said seriously. "Sophie says in Japan, if you fold 1,000 paper cranes, you get to make a wish." "That's the legend," Sophie confirmed. "Though I think the real magic is in the process, all that time and intention focused on one hope." "What would you wish for?" Daniel asked his daughter. Lila considered this with the gravity of a philosophy professor. "I think I'd wish for Mommy to come back, but Daddy says she can't. So maybe I'd wish for us to always be happy, even when we're sad." Daniel felt his heart squeeze. Sometimes his daughter's wisdom was almost too much to bear. "That's a beautiful wish," Sophie said quietly. "What about you, Daniel?" He looked around the table at his daughter's bright, hopeful face, at this mysterious young woman who had somehow made their house feel like a home again in the space of a week, at the scattered origami paper that represented hours of patient focus and shared creativity. "I think I'd wish for this," he said finally, "for more moments like this one." Sophie's smile was so soft and genuine that it took his breath away. "I think that's the most perfect wish I've ever heard." But even as the words warmed him, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Sophie Voss than met the eye. It wasn't just the origami skills or the way she seemed to have an endless supply of cash for groceries and art supplies. It was smaller things, the way she held herself, the unconscious grace in her movements, the fact that she never talked about family or friends or anything from her life before she'd knocked on his door. That night, after Lila was asleep and Sophie had retreated to her room to study, Daniel found himself standing in the kitchen, staring at the neat stack of $100 bills she'd left on the counter for next month's rent. Who was this girl who dressed like a struggling college student, but paid rent with crisp hundreds? who seemed genuinely happy to spend her Friday night teaching origami to an 8-year-old, but had no photos, no mementos, nothing to suggest a life outside these walls. As if summoned by his thoughts, Sophie emerged from her room, padding barefoot to the kitchen in pajamas and an oversized sweatshirt. She moved quietly, but something about her posture suggested she was as restless as he was. "Can't sleep either?" she asked softly. "Long day," Daniel replied, though that wasn't really it. I'm not much of a sleeper." Sophie poured herself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. In the dim light from the stove, she looked even younger than her 20 years. "Thank you, by the way." "For what?" "For welcoming me here. For letting me be part of—" She gestured vaguely around the kitchen, as if trying to encompass something larger than the physical space. "This, whatever this is. You don't have to thank me for that. You pay rent. This is your home too for as long as you want it to be." "That's just it, though. You didn't have to make it feel like home. You and Lila, you could have just been landlord and tenant, kept it business. But you didn't." Sophie's voice was quiet, almost wondering. "Do you know how rare that is, real kindness, no strings attached?" Daniel studied her face in the dim light. There was something almost desperate in her gratitude, as if simple human decency was foreign to her experience. "Sophie, can I ask you something?" She tensed slightly. "Sure." "Are you okay? I mean really okay? Because if you're running from something or someone, or if you need help—" "I'm fine," she said quickly. Too quickly. "I'm safe here. That's what matters." "Safe from what?" For a moment, he thought she might actually answer him. Her mouth opened slightly, and he saw a war playing out behind her eyes, the desire to trust warring with what looked like years of learned caution. "Just my past," she said finally. "Nothing dangerous. Nothing that affects you or Lila. I promise." Daniel wanted to push, but something in her expression stopped him. Whatever Sophie was running from, she wasn't ready to share it. And maybe that was okay. Maybe everyone deserved a place to start over, no questions asked. "Well, you're safe here," he said simply, "for as long as you need to be." The relief that flooded her face was so profound that it made his chest ache. How long had it been since someone had offered her unconditional safety? "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what that means to me." But as she padded back to her room and Daniel finally headed to bed himself, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. Sophie Voss was running from something, that much was clear. The question was whether that something might eventually catch up to her and to them. The second week brought an October heat wave that had everyone in the neighborhood dragging fans out of storage and opening windows that had been sealed shut since spring. Daniel came home from work on Tuesday to find the house filled with the smell of something incredible, and Sophie standing at the stove stirring a pot of what looked like the most perfect marinara sauce he'd ever seen. "I hope you don't mind," she said, glancing up as he walked into the kitchen. "I got inspired at the farmer's market and may have gone a little overboard." The kitchen counter was covered with ingredients that definitely hadn't come from the discount grocery store where Daniel usually shopped. Fresh basil, San Marzano tomatoes, imported Parmesan that still had the price tag attached, $43 for a single block of cheese. "Sophie, this must have cost a fortune," Daniel said, fingering the edge of the price tag. "Oh, that—" Sophie's cheeks flushed pink. I got a scholarship refund check today. Financial aid. I thought it would be nice to cook a real meal for once." It was a perfectly reasonable explanation, but something about the way she said it, too casual, too rehearsed, made Daniel's radar ping again. College students didn't typically spend scholarship money on $40 cheese no matter how flush they were feeling. Sophie's making us a feast. Lila announced, bouncing into the kitchen with her backpack still on her shoulders. She let me help crush the garlic, and she knows how to make pasta from scratch. And she says we're going to have salad with flowers in it. Edible flowers, Sophie clarified, smiling at Lila's enthusiasm. From the farmer's market. They're perfectly safe, I promise. I've never had flowers in my salad, Lila said, with the kind of reverence most kids reserved for ice cream and Christmas morning. Well, tonight's a night for new experiences, Sophie said, and something in her voice made Daniel look at her more closely. There was a brightness to her smile that seemed almost forced, as if she were trying very hard to project happiness. Dinner was spectacular. The pasta was silky and perfect, the sauce rich with flavors that made Daniel's frozen dinner palate weep with joy, and Lila declared the flower-studded salad to be the most beautiful food in the history of the world. But throughout the meal, Daniel found himself watching Sophie more than eating. She picked at her food despite having cooked enough to feed a small army. She laughed at Lila's jokes and asked interested questions about Daniel's day, but there was something brittle about her cheerfulness, as if she were performing the role of the happy dinner companion rather than actually experiencing it. "Sophie, are you feeling okay?" he asked as they cleared the dishes. "You barely touched your food." "I'm fine," she said, but her smile was strained. "Just tired. It's been a long day." "Why don't you go rest? Lila and I can handle cleanup." "But I made the mess. And you made us an incredible meal. Go, rest, doctor's orders." Sophie looked like she might argue, but something in his tone must have convinced her. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything. Having a family dinner like this. It's been a long time." She was gone before Daniel could ask what she meant by that, leaving him staring after her with more questions than answers. "Daddy, is Sophie sad?" Lila asked as they loaded the dishwasher. "I think she might be, sweetheart." "Why do you ask?" "She gets this look sometimes. Like when I talk about Mommy. Like something hurts inside, but she's trying not to show it." Daniel paused a dirty plate halfway to the dishwasher. His daughter's emotional intelligence never ceased to amaze him. "What kind of look?" "Like this," Lila demonstrated, forcing her mouth into a smile while letting her eyes go flat and distant. It was eerily accurate to Sophie's expression during dinner. "That's very observant of you, kiddo. Do you think we should help her feel better? Like how people helped us when Mommy died?" Daniel's throat tightened. After Maria's death, their neighbors had rallied around them in ways that still brought tears to his eyes. Casseroles and babysitting, and shoulders to cry on when the grief felt too big to bear alone. "I think the best thing we can do is just be here for her," Daniel said carefully. "Sometimes people need time before they're ready to share what's hurting them. Like how I needed time before I could talk about Mommy without crying." "Exactly like that." Lila nodded with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children bring to complex emotional truths. "Okay, but I'm going to make her a picture tomorrow. Pictures always make me feel better when I'm sad." That night, Daniel lay awake thinking about Sophie's words at dinner. "It's been a long time since I had a family dinner like this." What did that mean she was 20 years old? When was the last time she'd sat around a table with people who cared about her? He was still puzzling over it when he heard soft footsteps in the hallway. His bedside clock read 2:17 a.m. Daniel slipped out of bed and crept to his door, peering through the crack. Sophie was tiptoeing toward the kitchen, moving with the careful stealth of someone who didn't want to wake anyone. She was fully dressed in jeans and a dark sweater, and she carried what looked like a laptop bag over her shoulder. Daniel's first thought was that she was leaving, packing up and slipping away in the middle of the night, like some kind of modern-day Cinderella. But instead of heading for the front door, she settled at the kitchen table and opened what he now recognized as his old laptop, the one he'd left sitting in the junk drawer for months, because it was too slow to be useful for anything but basic word processing. What was she doing with his computer at 2 in the morning? Daniel watched as Sophie connected something to the laptop, a small red device that looked like a flash drive. The laptop screen illuminated her face in the darkness, casting shadows that made her look older, more serious. She worked quickly and quietly, her fingers flying over the keyboard, with the kind of practiced efficiency that spoke of long familiarity with whatever she was doing. After about 20 minutes, she disconnected the device and slipped it into her pocket. But instead of closing the laptop immediately, she sat back in her chair and stared at the screen for a long moment. Even from his limited vantage point, Daniel could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands clenched and unclenched in her lap. Finally, she closed the laptop and crept back to her room, moving just as quietly as she'd come. Daniel waited until he heard her door click shut before returning to his bed, his mind racing. What had Sophie been doing with his computer? What was on that red flash drive? And why did she look like someone carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders? He told himself it was none of his business. Sophie was an adult, and she had every right to her privacy and her secrets. But something deep in his gut, the same instinct that had kept him safe during his brief stint in the military, the same intuition that had told him Maria was sicker than the doctors were letting on, was telling him that whatever Sophie was hiding, it was big. And it was dangerous. The next morning brought no answers, only more questions. Sophie appeared at breakfast, looking perfectly normal, tired perhaps, but no more so than any college student during midterm season. She helped Lila with her math homework, discussed dinner plans, and gave no indication that she'd been awake half the night, doing mysterious things with Daniel's laptop. But Daniel found himself watching her more closely, cataloging the small inconsistencies he'd been unconsciously noting for weeks. The way she never received mail, never got phone calls, never mentioned a single person from her supposed life at college. The expensive ingredients she bought with cash, the perfect origami skills, the unconscious grace that spoke of etiquette lessons and country club memberships. Most telling of all was the way she interacted with Lila. Sophie was wonderful with his daughter, patient, kind, genuinely interested in an 8-year-old's concerns and enthusiasms. But there was something almost desperate about her attention, as if she were trying to memorize every moment, store up every smile and laugh against some future famine. "Sophie, can I ask you something?" Daniel said that evening as they finished dinner. "Of course." "What's your major at college, I mean? You mentioned art, but—" "Studio art, with a focus on social justice," Sophie replied without hesitation. "I'm particularly interested in how art can be used to expose truth and create change." It was a good answer, specific enough to sound real, idealistic enough to fit her apparent age, but something about the way she said it reminded Daniel of the carefully rehearsed responses politicians gave during press conferences. "That sounds fascinating. Are you working on any projects right now?" Sophie's hand went unconsciously to the silver bracelet at her wrist, turning it in a nervous gesture Daniel was beginning to recognize. "Just some research," she said. "For my senior thesis. It's about corporate responsibility and environmental justice. How big companies sometimes prioritize profits over people's safety." "Sounds important." "It is." For the first time since he'd known her, Sophie's voice carried real passion, real fire. "You'd be amazed how much harm a single corporation can do when they think no one is watching. The lives they can destroy, the communities they can poison, all in the name of the bottom line." There was something personal in her anger, something that went beyond academic interest or youthful idealism. Daniel was about to press further when Lila piped up from across the table. "Sophie, I made you something today." She jumped up from her chair and ran to her backpack, returning with a piece of construction paper covered in crayon drawings. "What's this?" Sophie asked, her voice immediately softening as she examined Lila's artwork. "It's our family," Lila explained proudly. "See, there's me, and there's Daddy, and there's you. And that's our house, and those are Mommy's roses in the garden, and those are the cranes we're making on the table." Daniel looked at the drawing over Sophie's shoulder. Lila had drawn 3 stick figures holding hands in front of a house with a garden full of flowers and a table covered in tiny paper birds. But what made his breath catch was the care with which she'd drawn Sophie, not just as an addition to their family, but as an integral part of it, connected to him and Lila by the chain of linked hands. "Lila, this is beautiful," Sophie whispered, and Daniel heard the tremor in her voice. "Thank you. This is the most wonderful gift anyone has ever given me. Really, really. I'm going to treasure it forever." As Sophie carefully propped the drawing against the salt shaker so she could see it while they finished eating, Daniel caught sight of tears gathering in her eyes. The raw emotion on her face was like looking at someone's heart laid bare gratitude and longing, and something that looked almost like grief. Who was this girl who was moved to tears by a child's crayon drawing? Who spoke with authority about corporate corruption, but claimed to be just a college student? Who had enough money to buy expensive groceries, but lived like someone in hiding? And why did Daniel get the feeling that whatever Sophie was running from was about to catch up with all of them? That night, he made a decision. If Sophie was going to continue living under his roof around his daughter, he needed to know what he was dealing with. He waited until she was asleep, then crept to the kitchen and opened his old laptop. If Sophie had been using it for something important, maybe she'd left traces behind. What he found made his blood run cold and changed everything he thought he knew about the quiet girl who had wandered into their lives, asking for nothing more than a room to rent. In the browser, history deleted, but still recoverable with a little technical knowledge Daniel had picked up during his brief stint in IT, before the layoffs were dozens of searches related to water contamination, environmental lawsuits, and corporate cover-ups. But it wasn't the general research that made his hands shake as he scrolled through the list. It was the specific searches. Raven Lake water crisis. Voss Industries settlement. Richard Voss criminal investigation. And then, most damning of all, how to contact FBI Environmental Crimes Unit. Daniel sat back in his chair, his mind reeling. Voss Industries. He knew that name. Everyone in their small industrial town knew that name because Voss Industries was the company that had owned the chemical plant on the outskirts of town. The plant that had been shut down 5 years ago after it was discovered that they'd been illegally dumping toxins into the groundwater for decades. The plant that had poisoned 17 people. The plant that had killed his wife. Sophie's last name was Voss. The room seemed to spin around him as the implications crashed over him like a tidal wave. Sophie Voss. Not just any college student looking for a cheap room. Not just a young woman running from her past. Sophie Voss, daughter of Richard Voss, the billionaire CEO, whose company had murdered Maria and 16 other innocent people. The girl sleeping in his spare room. The girl his daughter adored. The girl who had become part of their family over the past 2 weeks. She was the daughter of the man who had destroyed Daniel's life. And she'd been using his computer to research her father's crimes. Daniel closed the laptop with shaking hands, his mind struggling to process what this meant. Was Sophie working with her father? Was she some kind of spy sent to monitor him in case he ever tried to pursue legal action? The settlement he'd received after Maria's death had been pathetically small, barely enough to cover the funeral costs. and the lawyers had made it clear that Voss Industries' legal team was too powerful to fight. But that didn't make sense either. If Sophie was working for her father, why would she be researching FBI contact information? Why would she look up details about the water crisis that her father's company had caused, unless she was trying to expose him? Daniel sat in the darkened kitchen until dawn, turning the possibilities over in his mind, like pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. Every interaction he'd had with Sophie over the past 2 weeks took on new meaning. Every kindness and every evasion filtering through the lens of this devastating revelation. She'd known. From the moment she'd knocked on his door, she'd known exactly who he was, exactly what her father's company had done to his family. The question was, what did she plan to do about it? And what would happen to Lila when the truth inevitably came out? As the first light of dawn crept through the kitchen windows, Daniel made his own decision. He would confront Sophie directly, demand answers, find out exactly what game she was playing. He owed it to Maria's memory and to Lila's safety to get to the truth, no matter how much it might hurt, to lose the fragile sense of family they'd built over the past 2 weeks. But first he had to prepare himself for the possibility that everything Sophie's kindness, her connection with Lila, the warmth that had returned to their house had been nothing more than an elaborate lie. The daughter of his wife's killer was living under his roof, sharing meals at his table, tucking his daughter into bed each night. And Daniel had no idea whether she was there to help him or destroy him. The morning sun cast long shadows across the kitchen floor as Daniel heard Sophie's door open and her soft footsteps padding toward the bathroom. In a few minutes, she would emerge to help Lila get ready for school, to make coffee and small talk, and continue the charade of being just another struggling college student. But now Daniel knew better. Now he knew that behind Sophie's quiet smiles and gentle manner lay secrets that could either save them all or tear their fragile world apart. The only question was, which would it be? The coffee mug trembled in Daniel's hands as Sophie emerged from the bathroom, her hair still damp from the shower, wearing the same thrift store clothes that now seemed like an elaborate costume. She moved through their morning routine with practiced ease, helping Lila find her missing shoe, braiding her hair into neat plaits, packing an extra juice box into her lunch bag, all while Daniel watched with new eyes that saw deception in every kindness. "You're quiet this morning," Sophie observed, glancing at him over Lila's head as she worked. "Everything okay?" The casual concern in her voice made his stomach twist. How many times over the past 2 weeks had she asked that same question? How many times had he opened up to her about his struggles, his fears, his grief over Maria's death, never knowing that she was the daughter of the man responsible for all of it? Just tired. Daniel managed forcing his voice to sound normal for Lila's sake. "Long night." Sophie's fingers paused in Lila's hair for just a moment, and Daniel caught something flicker across her face, guilt maybe, or recognition. Did she know that he knew? Had she seen him at the computer last night? "Daddy looks funny," Lila announced with the brutal honesty of childhood. "Like when he's thinking really hard about sad things." "I'm fine, sweetheart," Daniel said quickly. "Just worried about work stuff." But Sophie was watching him now with those storm-gray eyes that seemed to see too much. "If you need to talk," she said quietly, "I'm here. Whatever it is." The offer hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that Lila couldn't understand, but that made Daniel's chest burn with anger and confusion. Whatever it is. As if she didn't know exactly what was eating at him. As if she hadn't been living in his house under false pretenses, letting his daughter grow attached to her while hiding the truth about who she really was. "I appreciate that," Daniel said, his voice tight with control. "Really." After Lila left for school, the house fell into an uncomfortable silence. Sophie retreated to her room with her laptop, claiming she had research to do, while Daniel paced the kitchen like a caged animal. Every instinct screamed at him to confront her immediately, to demand answers and explanations. But another part of him, the part that had watched her teach his daughter origami with infinite patience, that had seen her eyes fill with tears over a crayon drawing, couldn't quite reconcile the caring young woman he'd come to know with the corporate spy his paranoid mind had conjured. By noon, the tension was unbearable. Daniel knocked on Sophie's door, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Come in," she called, and he found her sitting at the small desk surrounded by papers and printouts. The laptop screen showed what looked like legal documents, and Daniel caught glimpses of familiar names: Voss Industries, Raven Lake. Environmental impact before Sophie quickly minimized the window. "We need to talk," Daniel said, closing the door behind him. Sophie's face went pale. "About what? About who you really are." Daniel's voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. "About why the daughter of Richard Voss is living in my house, playing house with my family, pretending to be someone she's not." The silence that followed was deafening. Sophie stared at him for a long moment, her face cycling through shock, fear, and finally something that looked almost like relief. "How long have you known?" she asked quietly. "Since last night. I saw the browser history on my laptop. Voss Industries. Raven Lake. Your father's company." Daniel's voice cracked on the last words. "The company that killed my wife." Sophie flinched as if he'd struck her. "Daniel, I can explain. Can you explain why you're here? Why you sought me out specifically? Is this some kind of sick game for you and your father? Come play house with the grieving widower, see how much you can hurt him before you get bored." "No." Sophie shot to her feet, her eyes blazing with an intensity he'd never seen before. "It's not like that at all. My father doesn't know I'm here. He doesn't know anything about you or Lila or this house. If he did—" She swallowed hard. "If he did, he'd probably have me committed to keep me quiet." "Keep you quiet about what?" Sophie looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing something massive in her mind. Then she walked to her dresser and pulled out the red flash drive Daniel had seen her use the night before. "About this," she said, holding it up. "About everything he's done. Everything he's covered up. All the people he's killed." Daniel stared at the small device. "What's on there?" "Proof. Internal company documents, emails, financial records. 5 years' worth of evidence that my father knew exactly what his company was doing to the water supply around Raven Lake. He knew people were getting sick, knew they were dying, and he ordered his executives to cover it up because fixing the problem would have cost too much money." The room seemed to tilt around Daniel. "You have proof that he knew." "I have proof that he ordered it." Sophie's voice was barely above a whisper. "Maria wasn't just a casualty of corporate negligence, Daniel. She was murdered. They all were. 17 people that we know of, maybe more. And my father signed off on every decision that led to their deaths." Daniel sank into the desk chair, his legs suddenly unable to support him. How do you know all this?" Sophie sat down on the edge of the bed, the flash drive cradled in her palms, like something precious and dangerous. "Because I've been stealing it, piece by piece for the past 3 years. Ever since I found out what he did." "You've been stealing from your own father." "He's not my father." The venom in Sophie's voice was startling. "A father doesn't murder innocent people for profit. A father doesn't threaten his own daughter when she asks too many questions. Richard Voss is a monster who happens to share my DNA, nothing more." Daniel studied her face, looking for any sign of deception. But all he saw was pain, raw, honest pain that mirrored his own grief. "When did you find out about Raven Lake?" "3 years ago. I was 17, still living at home, still believing he was just a successful businessman who worked hard to provide for his family." Sophie's laugh was bitter. "I was doing research for a school project about environmental justice, and I came across an article about the water contamination. It mentioned that Voss Industries had reached a settlement with the victims' families, but the details were sealed." "So you investigated?" "I tried to ask him about it directly first. Thought maybe there was some explanation, some way it wasn't as bad as it sounded." Sophie shook her head. "He lost his mind. Screamed at me for an hour about family loyalty and corporate espionage and how I was too naive to understand the complexities of business. Then he had my computer monitored, my phone tapped my movements, tracked by security. Jesus. That's when I knew. When your own father treats you like a threat for asking questions about dead people, you know he's guilty." Sophie turned the flash drive over in her hands. "So I started being more careful. Started collecting evidence whenever I could. Every time I was home from boarding school, every holiday break, every summer internship at his company. I've been building this case for 3 years." Daniel felt like he was drowning in information, struggling to process the magnitude of what Sophie was telling him. Why risk everything to expose him? Because someone has to. Sophie's voice was fierce now, passionate in a way that reminded Daniel of Maria when she talked about the causes she cared about. "He's gotten away with murder, Daniel. Literal murder. And he's still out there, still running companies, still making decisions that affect people's lives. How many more Marias have to die before someone stops him?" The mention of his wife's name sent a fresh wave of grief and rage through Daniel's chest. "So why are you here? Why come to me?" "Because you have standing." Sophie leaned forward, her eyes intense. "You're a victim. Your family was directly harmed by his actions. If this evidence comes from you, from someone with skin in the game, it carries more weight than if it comes from his estranged daughter with a grudge. You want me to be your front man. I want you to get justice for Maria." Sophie's voice was gentle now, understanding. "I know this is a lot to process. I know you probably hate me right now, and I don't blame you. But Daniel, this is our chance. Maybe our only chance to make him pay for what he did." Daniel stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. His mind was reeling, cycling between fury and hope and a dozen other emotions he couldn't name. For 3 years, he'd carried the weight of knowing that the people responsible for Maria's death had gotten away with it. The settlement had been a joke, the investigation perfunctory, the legal system stacked against ordinary people like him who couldn't afford to fight billion-dollar corporations. But now, "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked, without turning around. "We take this to the FBI. Together. You as the victim seeking justice, me as the whistleblower with evidence. The media attention alone would be enough to force a real investigation, and with this documentation," Sophie held up the flash drive again, "they'd have no choice but to prosecute. And what happens to you when your father finds out you're the one who betrayed him?" Sophie was quiet for so long that Daniel finally turned around. She was staring at her hands, her face pale and resigned. "I lose everything," she said simply. "My trust fund, my inheritance, my family name. He'll disown me completely, probably try to have me prosecuted for theft and corporate espionage. I'll be lucky if I don't end up in prison." "Then why risk it?" Sophie looked up at him, and Daniel saw something in her eyes that took his breath away, a fierce determination that reminded him painfully of Maria. "Because it's the right thing to do. Because 17 people are dead and someone needs to answer for it. Because I've spent 3 years living with the knowledge that my father is a killer, and I can't do it anymore." Her voice broke slightly. "And because in the past 2 weeks, living here with you and Lila, I've remembered what it feels like to be part of a real family. A family built on love and honesty instead of money and fear. I want to be worthy of that." Daniel sank back into the chair, his head in his hands. Everything he'd thought he knew about his life, about Sophie, about the past 2 weeks, had been turned upside down. But underneath the shock and betrayal, another feeling was growing, something that felt dangerously like hope. "There's something else you should know," Sophie said quietly. "Something I found in the documents that I haven't told you yet." Daniel looked up. "What?" "The settlement your lawyer negotiated. It wasn't the full amount Voss Industries was prepared to pay. They had authorization to go as high as $2 million per family, but your lawyer settled for $50,000. The number hit Daniel like a physical blow. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying your lawyer sold you out. He was on Voss Industries' payroll, paid to keep the settlements as low as possible, and make sure none of the families ever learned the full extent of the company's liability." Daniel felt the rage building in his chest, like a pressure cooker about to explode. $50,000. That's what they'd valued Maria's life at. $50,000 to cover her funeral, her medical bills, and somehow rebuild his life as a single father. Meanwhile, they'd been prepared to pay 40 times that amount. "I have the documentation," Sophie continued. "Email chains, payment records, the whole conspiracy. Your lawyer wasn't just incompetent, Daniel. He was actively working against you." "Son of a bitch." Daniel's voice was barely controlled. "All this time I thought we just couldn't afford to fight them. I thought the system was rigged but fair. I never imagined that they were rigging it specifically against you, against all of you." Sophie stood up and moved closer to him. "Daniel, with this evidence, you could not only get justice for Maria, you could sue for the full amount you were entitled to. Maybe more given the fraud and conspiracy charges. $2 million. It was more money than Daniel had ever imagined having. More than enough to secure Lila's future, to send her to college, to give her the kind of life Maria had dreamed of for their daughter. But it wasn't about the money. It had never been about the money. "How do I know this isn't some elaborate con?" Daniel asked, hating himself for the question, but needing to ask it anyway. "How do I know you're not setting me up, somehow getting me to trust you, so you can destroy the evidence and protect your father?" Sophie reached into her pocket and pulled out her silver bracelet, the one Daniel had noticed she never took off. With careful fingers, she opened what he now realized was a hidden clasp, revealing a tiny USB port built into the jewelry. "Because this bracelet contains backup copies of everything," she said, holding it out to him. "And because I'm about to give it to you as insurance. If I betray you, if this turns out to be some kind of setup, you'll still have the evidence. You can take it to the authorities yourself." Daniel stared at the bracelet, overwhelmed by the gesture. "Sophie, I can't take that. If it's your only insurance, it's not my only insurance anymore." Sophie's smile was sad but genuine. "I have you now. I have Lila. I have a family that cares about me for who I am, not what I'm worth or who my father is. That's worth more than any amount of money or evidence." The simple honesty in her voice broke something open in Daniel's chest. For 3 years, he'd carried the weight of injustice and grief alone, believing that the people responsible for Maria's death were untouchable. Now, suddenly, he wasn't alone anymore. "What happens next?" he asked. "We plan carefully. My father has resources and connections that most people can't imagine. If we're going to do this, we need to be smart about it. We need to make sure the evidence gets to the right people, that it can't be buried or discredited. And in the meantime, Sophie looked around the small room that had become her sanctuary. In the meantime, I keep being Sophie Voss, struggling college art student. Because the moment my father finds out where I am, this all becomes a lot more dangerous for everyone involved. Daniel thought about Lila, about the joy on his daughter's face when she talked about Sophie, about the paper crane family she'd drawn, showing all three of them connected. Lila doesn't know any of this. No, and maybe she doesn't need to, at least not yet. She's been through enough trauma for one childhood. She's going to be devastated when she finds out you've been lying to her. I know. Sophie's voice was barely a whisper. I hate that I've put her in this position. I hate that I've put you in this position. If I could have found another way. But you couldn't. No, I couldn't. Daniel stood up and walked to the window again, looking out at the yard where Maria's roses were preparing for their winter dormancy. For 3 years, he'd felt like he was drowning in grief and helplessness, watching his daughter grow up without her mother, while the people responsible lived in luxury and freedom. Now, for the first time since Maria's death, he felt like he could breathe again. Okay, he said, turning back to Sophie. Let's do it. Let's take down your father. The relief that flooded Sophie's face was so profound that Daniel almost reached out to comfort her. Almost. Because despite everything she'd told him, despite the evidence and the explanations, and the obvious pain in her voice, there was still a part of him that couldn't quite trust her completely. She was still Richard Voss's daughter. She was still the child of the man who had killed Maria. And no matter how much she claimed to hate her father, no matter how much evidence she had against him, family loyalty was a complicated thing. There's one more thing, Sophie said, as if reading his thoughts. Before we move forward, before we involve the FBI or the media or anyone else, I want you to verify everything I've told you. Take the flash drive to an expert, have them authenticate the documents. Run background checks on me, investigate my story, whatever you need to do to satisfy yourself that this is real. You'd be okay with that? Daniel, you're about to risk everything on the word of someone you've known for 2 weeks. Someone who's been lying to you about fundamental aspects of her identity. Of course, you should verify what I'm telling you. I'd be worried about your judgment if you didn't. The honesty in her voice, the complete willingness to submit to scrutiny, went a long way toward easing Daniel's lingering doubts. A con artist wouldn't invite investigation. A corporate spy wouldn't hand over evidence that could expose her own deception. All right, Daniel said. I'll need a few days to check everything out, maybe a week. Take as long as you need. I'm not going anywhere. And Sophie, while we're being honest with each other, I need to know something else. She tensed slightly. What? That night I saw you using my computer. You were researching FBI contact information. Were you planning to do this with or without me? Sophie was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. I was hoping to do it with you. But if you'd said no, if you'd asked me to leave. She shrugged. Yes, I would have gone to them alone. I couldn't keep carrying this secret, Daniel. It was eating me alive. Even knowing what it would cost you. Especially knowing what it would cost me. Some things are more important than money or family connections or personal safety. Justice is one of them. Daniel nodded slowly. It was the answer he'd hoped for, even though it scared him. Because if Sophie was willing to sacrifice everything to expose her father's crimes, she was also someone who might be willing to sacrifice anything, including Daniel and Lila, to achieve that goal. But looking at her now, seeing the exhaustion and determination and quiet courage in her face, Daniel found himself believing her. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe he was setting himself up for another devastating betrayal. But something deep in his gut told him that Sophie Voss was exactly who she claimed to be, a young woman trying to make amends for her father's sins, even if it destroyed her in the process. 1 week, Daniel said finally. 1 week to verify everything, and then we decide how to move forward. 1 week, Sophie agreed. As Daniel left her room and closed the door behind him, he felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff, about to jump into an abyss, with no guarantee of what waited at the bottom. For 3 years, he'd played it safe, kept his head down, focused on just getting through each day with Lila. Now he was about to declare war on one of the most powerful men in the country. It was terrifying. It was dangerous. It was probably going to destroy the fragile peace he'd built for himself and his daughter. But for the first time since Maria's death, Daniel felt truly alive. Because finally, after 3 long years of grief and helplessness, he had a chance to fight back. And he was going to take it no matter what the cost. The weight of the red flash drive in Daniel's jacket pocket felt like carrying a loaded weapon as he walked through the doors of Morrison & Associates, the only cybersecurity firm in their small town. 3 days had passed since Sophie's confession. 3 days of careful research and sleepless nights, as Daniel tried to verify the impossible story she'd told him. The preliminary background checks had come back clean. Sophie Voss was indeed enrolled at the local college, indeed the daughter of billionaire Richard Voss, and indeed had no criminal record or obvious red flags. But the real test was the data itself. "Mr. Cole," the receptionist's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Mr. Morrison will see you now." James Morrison was a grizzled former FBI agent who'd opened his own firm after retirement, specializing in corporate digital forensics. Daniel had found him through an online search for data authentication experts, and had been relieved to discover that Morrison had actually worked on corporate fraud cases during his federal career. If anyone could tell him whether Sophie's evidence was legitimate, it would be this man. "So you've got some documents you need verified," Morrison said, settling behind his desk, with the casual authority of someone who'd seen every kind of deception imaginable. "What's the nature of the case?" Daniel had rehearsed this moment, but his mouth still felt dry as he pulled out the flash drive. "Environmental cover-up. Water contamination that led to multiple deaths. I need to know if these internal company documents are authentic before I take them to the authorities." Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's a serious allegation. What company are we talking about?" "Voss Industries." The change in Morrison's demeanor was immediate and unmistakable. His casual professionalism hardened into something more focused, more intense. "Richard Voss's company. You know it. I know of it. Worked a case involving one of their subsidiaries about 8 years ago. Nothing ever stuck, but—" Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying Daniel with new interest. "Let me guess. Raven Lake." Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs. "You know about Raven Lake." "Son, half the Environmental Crimes Unit knows about Raven Lake. Problem is, knowing about something and being able to prove it in court are two very different things. Voss Industries has lawyers that cost more per hour than most people make in a year, and they're very good at making evidence disappear." Morrison held out his hand for the flash drive. "But if you've got something new, something they missed the first time around, I'd be very interested to see it." The next 2 hours felt like an eternity. Daniel sat in Morrison's waiting room drinking terrible coffee and trying not to think about what would happen if the documents turned out to be fake. If Sophie had somehow fabricated everything, if this was all an elaborate setup designed to humiliate him or destroy what little credibility he had as a victim of corporate negligence. When Morrison finally emerged from his office, his face was grim. "Mr. Cole, I need you to tell me exactly how you came by this information." Daniel's stomach dropped. "Is it fake?" "Oh, it's real all right. Real enough that I'm surprised you're still walking around free instead of having an unfortunate accident. Morrison sat down across from him, the flash drive cradled carefully in his palm. These aren't just smoking guns, Mr. Cole. This is a smoking arsenal. Email chains proving knowledge of contamination going back 7 years before the public disclosure. Financial records showing deliberate decisions to continue operations despite known health risks. Internal memos discussing strategies to minimize legal liability while maximizing profits from the contaminated facilities. Daniel felt the world tilt around him. So it's all true. Every word. And that's what scares me. Morrison leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. Whoever gave you this information had access to the highest levels of Voss Industries' internal communications. We're talking CEO-level clearance board meeting minutes, legal strategy sessions. This isn't something a disgruntled employee could have accessed. This came from inside the family. What are you saying? I'm saying you need to be very careful about who you trust, Mr. Cole. Because the only people who could have compiled this evidence are either Richard Voss himself or someone very close to him. And if it's the latter, they've just committed enough corporate espionage to spend the rest of their life in federal prison. Daniel thought about Sophie, about the pain in her eyes when she talked about her father, about the way she'd handed over her only insurance without hesitation. What if they were willing to take that risk? What if exposing the truth was worth more to them than their own safety? Morrison studied him for a long moment. Then you'd be dealing with either a saint or someone with a very personal reason to want Richard Voss destroyed. Either way, they're putting you in an incredibly dangerous position. Dangerous how? Mr. Cole, Richard Voss didn't become a billionaire by playing nice with people who threaten his interests. The last journalist who tried to investigate Voss Industries' environmental practices had his career destroyed overnight, suddenly found himself facing plagiarism charges, tax audits, and custody battles. All completely coincidental, of course. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. What happened to him? He's working at a small-town newspaper in Montana, now covering high school football games and town council meetings. His ex-wife got full custody of his kids, and his bank account was frozen for 6 months, while the IRS investigated irregularities in his tax returns. Morrison's smile was humorless. Like I said, Voss doesn't play nice. So what do you recommend? Honestly, I recommend you take this evidence and disappear somewhere very far away. Change your name, move to another country, and pretend you never saw any of this. Morrison handed the flash drive back to Daniel. But I'm guessing that's not what you want to hear. My wife was one of the people who died because of the contamination. I can't just walk away. I figured as much. In that case, you need to be smart about this. Don't go to the local authorities. Voss has connections everywhere, and small-town cops are easy to buy or intimidate. Don't trust anyone who approaches you offering help unless you can verify their credentials independently. And whatever you do, don't let anyone know you have this information until you're ready to release it all at once. Morrison stood up and walked to his filing cabinet, pulling out a business card. This is Special Agent Sarah Chen with the FBI's Environmental Crimes Unit. She's one of the few people in federal law enforcement who can't be bought, and she's been trying to build a case against Voss Industries for years. If you're going to trust anyone with this, trust her. Daniel pocketed the card, his mind racing. How long do I have? That depends on how careful your source has been about covering their tracks. If Voss suspects someone's been accessing his files, he'll have forensic accountants and digital investigators swarming over every computer in the company within hours. Once they trace the data theft back to the source. Morrison shrugged. Let's just say corporate espionage charges are the least of their worries. Daniel left Morrison's office with his head spinning and his hands shaking. The evidence was real. Sophie had been telling the truth about everything: her father's crimes, the cover-up, the deliberate decision to let people die rather than lose profits. But Morrison's warnings had also made it clear just how dangerous the path ahead would be, not just for Daniel, but for Sophie and Lila as well. By the time he got home, Daniel had made his decision. Whatever the risks, whatever the cost, he couldn't live with himself if he walked away from this chance for justice. Maria deserved better. The other 16 victims deserved better. And maybe, just maybe, there were future victims who could be saved if Richard Voss was finally held accountable for his actions. He found Sophie in the kitchen helping Lila with her homework at the table. The scene was so normal, so domestic, that for a moment Daniel could almost forget the earth-shattering revelations of the past few days. Sophie looked up as he entered, and he saw the question in her eyes. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked quietly. Sophie nodded and turned to Lila. "Why don't you finish your math problems, sweetheart? I'll check them when I get back." They stepped out onto the back porch, where the October air was crisp, and the last of Maria's roses clung stubbornly to their stems. Sophie wrapped her arms around herself against the chill and waited for Daniel to speak. "I had the documents verified," he said without preamble. "They're real, all of it." Sophie's shoulders sagged with what looked like relief and terror in equal measure. "Thank God. I was starting to worry that maybe I'd made mistakes, that the evidence wasn't as solid as I thought." "It's solid. More than solid. According to the expert I consulted, what you've compiled could bring down your father's entire empire." Daniel studied her face in the fading light. "The question is, are you ready for what that means?" "I've been ready for 3 years," Sophie said quietly. "The question is whether you're ready. Because once we start this, there's no going back. My father will use every resource at his disposal to destroy us." Daniel thought about Morrison's warnings about journalists whose careers had been ruined and investigators who'd faced mysterious legal troubles. Then he thought about Maria, about the way she'd looked at him in the hospital during those final weeks, the unspoken promise in her eyes that he would take care of Lila and somehow make meaning from the senseless tragedy of her death. "I'm ready," he said. "But we need to be smart about this. I've got a contact at the FBI, someone who specializes in environmental crimes. We need to get the evidence to her in a way that can't be suppressed or buried." "Agreed. But Daniel, there's something else we need to discuss." Sophie turned to face him fully, her expression serious. "What happens to Lila during all this? Because when this story breaks, when my father's crimes become public knowledge, this house is going to be swarmed with reporters and investigators and God knows who else. It's not going to be safe for an 8-year-old girl." Daniel felt his chest tighten. In all his planning and anger and desire for justice, he'd somehow managed to avoid thinking about the practical impact on his daughter. Lila was happy here, settled in her school and her routine. The thought of uprooting her life again, of exposing her to the media circus that would inevitably follow, made him feel sick. "Maybe we could send her to stay with my sister in Portland," he said slowly. "Just until things settle down. That might be wise. And Daniel—" Sophie's voice was even quieter now. "She's going to find out who I really am. When this all comes out, when my name is in the newspapers as the whistleblower who brought down Richard Voss, she's going to know that I've been lying to her about everything." The pain in Sophie's voice was unmistakable. Over the past 3 weeks, the bond between Sophie and Lila had grown stronger every day. They had inside jokes and shared projects, and the kind of easy affection that couldn't be faked. The thought of that relationship being poisoned by the revelation of Sophie's deception was almost unbearable. "We'll figure out how to explain it to her," Daniel said. "She's a smart kid. She'll understand that sometimes adults have to keep secrets to protect people. Will she? Or will she just see it as another betrayal by another adult who was supposed to care about her? Sophie's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Daniel, I love that little girl like she's my own sister. The thought of hurting her, of losing her trust. Hey. Daniel reached out without thinking and took Sophie's hand, squeezing gently. Lila loves you too. Whatever happens, whatever comes out, that's not going to change. Kids are more resilient than we give them credit for. Sophie nodded, but Daniel could see she wasn't entirely convinced. I hope you're right. Because losing both of you... She shook her head. I can't even think about it. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the last light fade from the sky. Daniel found himself acutely aware of Sophie's hand in his, of the way she fit perfectly against his side when she unconsciously moved closer for warmth. When had this happened? When had she stopped being just a tenant and become, what family? Something more than family. The thought was dangerous, terrifying in its implications. Because Sophie was still Richard Voss's daughter, still carrying secrets and baggage that could destroy everything Daniel had worked to build for himself and Lila. And yet, standing here, with her hand in his, and her quiet strength surrounding him like a shield, Daniel couldn't bring himself to care about the complications. We should go inside, Sophie said eventually. Lila will be wondering what happened to us. But neither of them moved. The moment felt too important, too fragile to break with something as mundane as homework and dinner preparations. Sophie, Daniel said, surprising himself with the words that came out. When this is all over, when your father is in prison, and the media attention dies down. What then? What do you want your life to look like? Sophie was quiet for so long that Daniel began to think she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I want a life where I can look at myself in the mirror without feeling ashamed. I want to use my art to tell stories that matter, to expose truth instead of hiding from it. I want to be someone worthy of the love you and Lila have shown me. She paused, and when she continued, her voice was even softer. And I want to wake up every morning, knowing that I'm home, really home with people who care about who I am instead of what I'm worth. Daniel felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the protective walls he'd built around his heart after Maria's death. You could have that. Here. With us. Could I, even after everything I've put you through? Even knowing that being with me means you'll always be looking over your shoulder, wondering if my father's people are watching. Richard Voss is going to prison, Sophie. And even if he wasn't, even if being with you meant living with that danger forever, I think... Daniel swallowed hard, amazed at his own courage. I think it would be worth it. Sophie turned to stare at him, her eyes wide with something that looked like hope and terror mixed together. Daniel, you can't mean that. You barely know me. 3 weeks ago you thought I was just a college student looking for a cheap room, and now I know you're someone brave enough to risk everything for justice. Someone kind enough to spend hours teaching origami to an 8-year-old girl. Someone strong enough to stand up to a billionaire father who's controlled her entire life. Daniel reached up to touch her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she probably didn't realize had fallen. I know enough. But what about Maria? What about... Maria would want me to be happy, Daniel said firmly. She would want Lila to have a mother figure who loves her unconditionally. And she would want justice for what happened to her, whatever the cost. Sophie leaned into his touch, her eyes closing as if the simple contact was almost too much to bear. I'm scared, Daniel. I'm terrified that I'm going to destroy everything good in your life just by being here. You're not going to destroy anything. You're going to help me build something better. Daniel's voice was steady now, certain in a way that surprised him. Together, as a family. When Sophie opened her eyes, they were bright with tears, and something else, something that looked like the beginning of real hope. A family, she repeated as if testing the words. A real family, built on truth this time, not secrets. Sophie smiled, then the first truly carefree smile Daniel had seen from her since the night she'd confessed her real identity. I'd like that. I'd like that more than anything. They might have stayed there forever, holding each other in the gathering darkness and planning a future that felt both impossible and inevitable. But the moment was interrupted by the sound of the back door opening and Lila's voice calling out into the night. Sophie, Daddy, I finished my math problems and I'm hungry, and also I think we need to fold more cranes because we only have 643, and that's not enough for a really good wish. Sophie laughed, the sound bright and genuine in the cool air. We're coming, sweetheart. And you're absolutely right about the cranes. As they walked back toward the house, toward the warmth and light where Lila waited with her homework, and her endless questions, and her simple faith that the adults in her life would always take care of her, and felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, complete and utter certainty about the future. It was going to be dangerous. It was going to be complicated. There would be legal battles and media attention, and probably more pain before it was all over. But they would face it together as a family. And for the first time since Maria's death, that felt like enough. The next morning brought an early frost and the first concrete step toward bringing Richard Voss to justice. Daniel sat at his kitchen table with his phone in one hand and Agent Sarah Chen's business card in the other, rehearsing what he would say when she answered. Sophie was across from him, hands wrapped around a coffee mug for warmth, looking simultaneously terrified and determined. They'd spent most of the night talking through their strategy planning, every detail of how they would present the evidence and protect themselves from the inevitable backlash. You don't have to do this, Sophie said for the 3rd time that morning. I could still go to her alone, keep you and Lila out of it entirely. We've been through this, Daniel replied, his finger hovering over the call button. You need me to give the evidence credibility, and I need you to verify its authenticity. We're stronger together. Before Sophie could argue further, Daniel pressed the button and held the phone to his ear. It rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. Agent Chen, Environmental Crimes Unit. Agent Chen, my name is Daniel Cole. I'm calling about Voss Industries and the Raven Lake contamination case. I have evidence that I believe you'll want to see. There was a pause on the other end of the line long enough that Daniel began to wonder if the call had been dropped. When Agent Chen spoke again, her voice was carefully controlled. Mr. Cole, can you tell me the nature of this evidence? Internal company documents proving that Voss Industries knew about the contamination years before it was publicly disclosed. Email chains, financial records, board meeting minutes. Everything you'd need to prove criminal conspiracy and willful negligence. Another pause. Mr. Cole, I'm going to need you to be very careful about what you say over the phone. Can you come to our field office in Seattle today, if possible? Daniel looked at Sophie, who nodded encouragingly. Yes, we can be there this afternoon. I'm not coming alone. The person who provided the evidence will be with me. I see. Mr. Cole, before you travel anywhere or speak to anyone else about this matter, I need you to understand that you may be putting yourself in significant danger. Voss Industries has resources and connections that extend far beyond what most people realize. I understand the risks, Agent Chen, but I also understand that 17 people are dead because of Richard Voss's decisions, and someone needs to be held accountable. 17. Agent Chen's voice sharpened with interest. The official death count was 15. The official death count was wrong. I have documentation proving that 2 additional deaths were directly linked to the contamination, but deliberately excluded from the public tallies to minimize legal liability. This time, the silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Daniel began to think Agent Chen had hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was tight, with barely controlled anger. Mr. Cole, I want you and your associate to drive straight to the Seattle field office. Don't stop anywhere. Don't talk to anyone else about this matter, and don't let the evidence out of your sight for even a moment. I'll meet you there personally. How do I know I can trust you? Because I've been trying to build a case against Richard Voss for 6 years, and what you're describing could finally give me the tools I need to put him away forever. Agent Chen's voice was fierce now, passionate in a way that reminded Daniel of Sophie when she talked about justice. Mr. Cole, if what you're telling me is true, you may have just handed me the biggest environmental crimes case of my career. Daniel felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. We'll see you this afternoon. Mr. Cole. One more thing. Watch your back on the drive up here. And if anything feels off, anything at all, call me immediately. The line went dead, leaving Daniel staring at his phone with his heart hammering against his ribs. She believes us, Sophie said, and Daniel could hear the amazement in her voice. She actually believes us. She's been investigating your father for 6 years. She's probably been waiting for evidence like this the whole time. Sophie nodded, but Daniel could see the fear creeping back into her expression. Daniel, once we walk into that FBI office, there's no going back. My father will know within hours that someone's turned against him, and he'll use every resource at his disposal to find out who. Are you having second thoughts? Sophie was quiet for a moment, staring down at her coffee. When she looked up, her eyes were clear and determined. No, I'm terrified, but I'm not having second thoughts. This is the right thing to do for Maria and for all the other victims, for you and Lila and everyone else who deserves to know the truth. Daniel reached across the table and took her hand. Then let's go bring down a billionaire. 3 hours later, they were sitting in a sterile conference room in the Seattle FBI field office, watching Agent Sarah Chen examine the contents of Sophie's flash drive with the intensity of a scientist studying a new species. Chen was younger than Daniel had expected, probably in her late 30s, with sharp eyes and the kind of focused energy that spoke of someone completely dedicated to her work. This is remarkable, Chen said, finally looking up from her laptop screen. I've been investigating Voss Industries for years, and I've never seen anything close to this level of internal documentation. Is it enough? Sophie asked. To prosecute him, I mean. It's enough to prosecute him, convict him, and probably dismantle his entire corporate empire in the process. Chen leaned back in her chair, studying Sophie with curious eyes. Voss, I have to ask how you gained access to these documents. The security clearance required to see board meeting minutes and internal legal strategy sessions. I'm his daughter, Sophie said simply. I've had access to company files since I was 16 and started doing summer internships. He never thought to restrict my access because he never imagined I'd use it against him. And you've been collecting this information for how long? 3 years. Ever since I found out what really happened at Raven Lake. Chen nodded slowly. Ms. Voss, you realize that by providing this evidence, you're essentially confessing to multiple felonies, corporate espionage, theft of proprietary information, violation of fiduciary duty. I realize that. I also realize that my father is a murderer who's been protected by wealth and political connections for far too long. Sophie's voice was steady, unwavering. I'm willing to accept whatever consequences come from exposing him. And Mr. Cole, you understand that as soon as we move forward with this investigation, you and your daughter will likely become targets. Richard Voss doesn't typically allow threats to his empire to go unanswered. Daniel thought about Lila, about the normal life he'd tried so hard to build for her after Maria's death. Then he thought about the 17 families who would never have that chance because of Richard Voss's greed. My daughter is already staying with relatives out of state, Daniel said. As for me, I've been living with the knowledge of my wife's murder for 3 years. At least now I have a chance to do something about it. Chen studied both of them for a long moment, as if weighing their resolve against the magnitude of what they were proposing. All right, she said finally. Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to take this evidence to my supervisor and the U.S. Attorney's Office. If they agree that we have enough for criminal charges, we'll move forward with arrests and indictments within the next 72 hours. 72 hours. Sophie looked pale. That fast? It has to be that fast. The moment Richard Voss suspects that someone has accessed his files, he'll destroy everything he can and disappear to a non-extradition country. Our only advantage is the element of surprise. Chen closed her laptop and stood up. In the meantime, I'm going to arrange for both of you to be placed in protective custody. Ms. Voss, your father has almost certainly had people watching you since you left home. If he hasn't figured out where you are yet, he will soon. Daniel felt his blood run cold. Are you saying he knows about Lila? I'm saying we can't take any chances. I'll have agents posted at your sister's house in Portland as a precaution, and I want both of you to stay in a safe house until we can make arrests. Sophie shook her head. Agent Chen, if I disappear now, my father will know something's wrong. He'll start covering his tracks, destroying evidence. We need to act like everything's normal until you're ready to move. Ms. Voss, with all due respect, acting normal could get you killed. And hiding could get dozens of other potential victims killed when my father realizes he's been exposed and starts destroying evidence. Sophie's voice was firm, resolved. I've been playing this role for 3 years, Agent Chen. I can handle 72 more hours. Daniel looked at Sophie, seeing the determination in her eyes, and feeling his heart clench with a mixture of pride and terror. She was willing to risk everything, including her life, to see this through to the end. If she stays, I stay, Daniel said. We're in this together. Agent Chen sighed, clearly unhappy with their decision, but recognizing that she couldn't force them into protective custody against their will. Fine, but I want you both to check in with me every 6 hours. And if anything at all feels wrong, you call me immediately and get somewhere safe. She handed them each a card with her direct number. I mean it. Richard Voss has killed to protect his secrets before, and he won't hesitate to do it again. As they left the FBI office and walked back to Daniel's car, Sophie was unusually quiet. It wasn't until they were on the highway heading home that she finally spoke. Daniel, what Agent Chen said about my father having people watch me. What if they've been watching your house? What if they know about Lila? Lila's safe. She's with my sister, and Chen's sending agents to watch them. Daniel reached over and squeezed Sophie's hand. We did the right thing, Sophie. Whatever happens next, we did the right thing. Sophie nodded, but Daniel could see the fear in her eyes. For 3 years, she'd been playing a dangerous game with one of the most powerful men in the country. Now finally, the game was almost over. The question was whether they would survive to see the ending. The black SUVs arrived at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night, their headlights cutting through the October darkness like searchlights hunting for prey. Daniel saw them first from his bedroom window, 3 identical vehicles moving slowly down Maple Street, their tinted windows reflecting nothing but shadows and menace. His blood turned to ice as they pulled to a stop directly in front of his house. "Sophie," he whispered urgently, shaking her awake where she'd fallen asleep on the living room couch while they waited for Agent Chen's next check-in call. "Sophie, wake up! They're here!" Sophie's eyes snapped open immediately, her body going rigid with a fear that spoke of long experience with midnight visitations. She moved to the window beside Daniel, her face draining of all color as she counted the vehicles. 3 cars, she whispered. That means at least 12 men, probably more. Daniel, when my father sends this kind of force, it's not for a conversation. What do we do? Before Sophie could answer, the lead SUV's door opened and a figure stepped out into the streetlight. Even from a distance, even after 3 years of seeing his face only in newspaper headlines and corporate press releases, Daniel recognized Richard Voss immediately. The billionaire was smaller than he appeared in photos, but there was something about his presence, an aura of absolute authority and barely contained violence that made him seem to fill the entire street. He came himself, Sophie breathed, and Daniel heard genuine terror in her voice for the first time since he'd known her. He never comes himself unless what? Unless he's planning to handle something permanently. More figures emerged from the other vehicles, men in expensive suits who moved with the fluid precision of professional bodyguards. Daniel counted 8 of them, all scanning the neighborhood with the methodical attention of soldiers securing a perimeter. Richard Voss walked slowly up the front path, his hands clasped behind his back, like a general surveying conquered territory. When he reached the front door, he didn't knock. Instead, he simply stood there, waiting, as if he knew that his presence alone would be enough to bring his daughter to him. "We have to call Agent Chen," Daniel said, reaching for his phone. "No." Sophie caught his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "If FBI agents show up now, if this turns into some kind of standoff, innocent people could get hurt. Mrs. Patterson next door, the Johnson family across the street, they don't deserve to be caught in the crossfire. So what do you suggest?" Sophie took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders in a gesture that reminded Daniel powerfully of a soldier preparing for battle. "I go out there. I talk to him. I try to convince him that I'm still his obedient daughter, who got a little lost but found her way home." "Absolutely not. Sophie, if he even suspects that you're the one who gave the FBI that evidence, then we're all dead anyway," Sophie said quietly. "Daniel, my father didn't bring a small army to Maple Street because he wants to have a heart-to-heart conversation. He knows. Maybe not all the details, maybe not exactly what I've done, but he knows enough to be here." As if summoned by their whispered conversation, Richard Voss's voice cut through the night air, amplified by some kind of speaker system in one of the SUVs. "Sophie, I know you're in there, sweetheart. Why don't you come outside so we can talk? Just you and me like old times." The endearment delivered in a tone that mixed paternal warmth with underlying steel made Daniel's skin crawl. There was something profoundly wrong about the way Richard Voss spoke to his daughter, as if she were simultaneously his most precious possession and his greatest disappointment. "He's giving me a chance," Sophie said, interpreting something in her father's tone that Daniel couldn't hear. "One last chance to come home quietly, to pretend this never happened. And if you don't..." Sophie looked around the living room at the origami cranes scattered across the coffee table, at Lila's artwork taped to the refrigerator, at the small domestic details that had made this house feel like home for the first time in years. "Then he makes sure I never have the chance to betray him again." "Sophie, listen to me." Daniel grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You are not going out there alone. We're calling the FBI, we're calling the local police, we're calling everyone we can think of until this street is swarming with law enforcement. And while we're making phone calls, he's destroying evidence and preparing to disappear to a country without extradition treaties. Sophie's voice was steady, resigned. Daniel, in 72 hours, Agent Chen was going to have enough to arrest him. But that was before he figured out what I'd done. Now, if I don't go out there and convince him that I'm still on his side, he'll be gone by morning, and 17 families will never get justice. I don't care about justice if it costs me you. The words were out before Daniel could stop them, hanging in the air between them like a confession. Sophie's eyes widened, filling with something that looked like heartbreak and wonder mixed together. Daniel, I mean it. I've lost one person I loved to Richard Voss's greed. I won't lose another. You love me. Sophie's voice was barely a whisper. Of course I love you. How could I not love you? You're brave and kind, and you make Lila laugh in ways I haven't heard since Maria died. You've brought light back into this house, into our lives. The thought of losing you, Daniel's voice cracked. Sophie, please. There has to be another way. Sophie reached up and touched his cheek, her fingers gentle against his skin. There isn't another way, Daniel, and you know it. Before Daniel could respond, Richard Voss's voice cut through the night again, this time with less patience and more steel. Sophie, you have 30 seconds to come outside voluntarily. After that, my associates and I will come inside to collect you. I'd hate for any of your friends to be injured in the process. The threat was unmistakable. Daniel looked out the window and saw the suited men moving closer to the house, their hands reaching inside their jackets in gestures that needed no interpretation. Okay, Sophie said, her voice suddenly calm with the terrible clarity of absolute decision. Okay, but Daniel, I need you to promise me something. Anything. When this is over, when my father is in prison and the truth comes out, I need you to tell Lila that I loved her, that every moment I spent with her was real, that none of it was an act or a manipulation. I need her to know that having her in my life, even for such a short time, was the greatest gift I've ever received. You'll tell her yourself when we get through this. Sophie smiled, then sad and beautiful and utterly heartbreaking. Daniel, my father has killed 17 people to protect his secrets. What makes you think he'll hesitate to kill one more? Before Daniel could answer, before he could find words for the terror and helplessness crushing his chest, Sophie was moving toward the front door. She paused at the hallway mirror, checking her appearance and composing her face into the mask of dutiful daughter that she'd apparently been wearing for years. Sophie, wait. Daniel caught her hand as she reached for the doorknob. I love you too. Whatever happens out there, I need you to know that. Sophie's composure cracked for just a moment, revealing the frightened young woman beneath the brave facade. I know. And Daniel, if something happens to me if I don't come back, don't let my father's people anywhere near Lila. Promise me. Nothing's going to happen to you. Promise me. I promise. Sophie nodded once, took a deep breath, and opened the front door. The October night air rushed into the house, carrying the smell of frost and exhaust, and something else, something that made every instinct Daniel had screamed danger. Sophie stepped out onto the front porch, her hands visible and empty, her posture carefully neutral. Hello, Father. Richard Voss smiled, and even from his position behind the window, Daniel could see that it was the kind of smile a predator might wear when cornering wounded prey. Hello, sweetheart. You've been causing me quite a bit of concern lately. Have I? I'm sorry to hear that. I've been perfectly fine, just focusing on my studies, like you always taught me. Your studies? Richard Voss walked closer to the porch, his bodyguards maintaining their positions, but clearly ready to move at a moment's notice. Art, wasn't it? Something about social justice and environmental activism. There was a trap in the question, some kind of test that Daniel couldn't decipher, but that clearly terrified Sophie. She remained perfectly still, her voice carefully modulated. Studio art with a focus on contemporary issues, yes. I'm working on my senior thesis. About corporate responsibility, I believe, how big companies sometimes prioritize profits over people's safety. Richard Voss's smile grew wider, more predatory. Fascinating subject. I'd love to hear more about your research. Daniel's blood turned to ice. Those were Sophie's exact words from weeks ago when he'd asked about her studies over dinner. Either Richard Voss had been listening to their conversations somehow, or, actually, I've been thinking about changing my thesis topic, Sophie said carefully. I'm not sure environmental issues are really my area of expertise after all. Oh, but I think they are. In fact, I think you've become quite the expert on environmental crimes over the past few years. Richard Voss pulled something from his jacket pocket, a tablet computer that he held up so Sophie could see the screen. Particularly crimes involving water contamination and industrial cover-ups. Even from his position at the window, Daniel could see Sophie's face go white. Whatever was on that screen, it was damning enough to shatter her careful composure. I don't know what you mean. Of course you don't. Just like you don't know anything about corporate data theft, or unauthorized access to confidential company files, or federal investigations into environmental crimes. Richard Voss's voice was still conversational, almost gentle, but there was steel underneath that made Daniel's skin crawl. Father, if you're suggesting that I've done something to betray the family, I'm not suggesting anything, Sophie. I'm telling you. Richard Voss held up the tablet again. 3 years, sweetheart. 3 years of systematic data theft, carefully documented and meticulously planned. Did you really think I wouldn't notice eventually? Sophie's shoulders sagged slightly, and Daniel saw the exact moment when she realized that her cover was completely blown. But instead of crumbling, instead of begging for forgiveness or trying to maintain her innocence, she straightened her spine and looked her father directly in the eye. Yes, she said quietly. I hoped you wouldn't notice until it was too late to matter. Richard Voss's smile disappeared. Too late for what? Too late to stop the FBI from arresting you for the murder of 17 innocent people. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel could see the bodyguards tensing their hands, moving inside their jackets. Richard Voss stood perfectly still for a long moment, his face cycling through emotions too quickly for Daniel to follow. When he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet and very dangerous. You gave them the files. I gave them everything, Father. Every email, every financial record, every board meeting minute that documents your decision to let people die rather than lose profits. By morning, federal agents will be knocking on your door with arrest warrants for conspiracy, environmental terrorism, and first-degree murder. You stupid, naive little girl. Richard Voss's composure finally cracked, revealing something ugly and violent underneath. Do you have any idea what you've done, what you've destroyed? I've destroyed a criminal empire built on the graves of innocent people, Sophie said firmly. And I'm proud of it. Richard Voss backhanded her across the face with enough force to send her stumbling backward into the porch railing. Daniel was moving before he consciously decided to act, bursting through the front door and onto the porch before any of the bodyguards could react. Don't you dare touch her! Daniel snarled, positioning himself between Sophie and her father. Richard Voss looked at him with the kind of contempt usually reserved for insects. Mr. Cole, I presume. The grieving widower who's been harboring my wayward daughter. The man whose wife you murdered, yes. I didn't murder anyone, Mr. Cole. I simply made business decisions based on cost-benefit analyses and legal advice. If some people happen to become ill as a result of industrial processes, well, that's simply the price of progress. The casual dismissal of Maria's death of 17 human lives, reduced to statistics in a corporate spreadsheet, sent a surge of rage through Daniel that was so pure and powerful, it was almost blinding. You sick bastard, Daniel said, his voice shaking with fury. They were people. Maria was a person, not a line item in your profit margins. Maria was a casualty of her own poor choices, Richard Voss replied coolly. She chose to live in an area with known industrial contamination. She chose to ignore the health warnings that were published in local newspapers. She chose to prioritize her comfort over her safety, and she paid the price for that choice. Daniel lunged forward before he could stop himself, his hands reaching for Richard Voss's throat. He made it exactly 2 steps before something hit him in the back of the head with enough force to send him sprawling across the porch. Daniel. Sophie dropped to her knees beside him, her hands checking for injuries, while the bodyguards closed in around them. I'm okay, Daniel mumbled, though his vision was swimming and there was blood running down the back of his neck. Sophie, run. Get inside and call Agent Chen. I'm not leaving you. How touching, Richard Voss said, his voice dripping with disdain. Young love blooming over the graves of the dead. Sophie, you will come with me now. Willingly, or Mr. Cole will join his wife in whatever afterlife awaits people who interfere with my business interests. One of the bodyguards pressed the barrel of a gun against the back of Daniel's head, the metal cold and unforgiving against his skin. Sophie's breath caught, and Daniel could see her fighting tears. You would kill him right here in front of the entire neighborhood. Sweetheart, I've killed 17 people to protect my interests. What's one more? Richard Voss checked his expensive watch with casual indifference. Besides, there won't be any witnesses. I've had this entire block evacuated under the pretense of a gas leak. Very unfortunate timing, really. Daniel's heart sank as he realized the truth of what Richard Voss was saying. The street was indeed eerily quiet, with no lights visible in any of the neighboring houses. Somehow, impossibly, Richard Voss had managed to clear the entire area of potential witnesses. You can't just murder people in the middle of suburbia, Sophie said desperately. There are security cameras, traffic lights, satellite surveillance, all of which can be handled with the right connections and sufficient financial motivation. Richard Voss interrupted. Sophie, you've spent 3 years learning about my business practices. Surely you understand by now that money can solve almost any problem. Almost any problem, Sophie repeated slowly, and Daniel heard something change in her voice, a note of defiance that made his chest tighten with fear. Yes, almost any. Sophie reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, holding it up so her father could see the screen. What about the problem of a live stream being broadcast to 10,000 followers on social media? Richard Voss's face went white. What did you say? I've been streaming this entire conversation live to my Instagram account, father. 10,000 followers, and counting, all watching you threaten to murder an innocent man to cover up your crimes. Sophie's smile was fierce, triumphant. How much money do you think it would take to make 10,000 witnesses forget what they've seen? The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder, getting closer. Richard Voss looked around frantically, clearly calculating his options, as law enforcement vehicles appeared at both ends of Maple Street. You clever little bitch, he said, and there was something almost like pride in his voice. "When did you start the stream?" "The moment I walked out the front door. Every threat, every confession, every casual admission of murder, it's all been broadcast live to the internet." Sophie's voice was steady now, confident. "It's over, Father. You can kill Daniel and me, but you can't kill the truth anymore." FBI vehicles were pouring onto the street now, followed by local police cars and what looked like a SWAT team. Agent Chen emerged from the lead vehicle with her weapon drawn, shouting orders to the tactical officers spreading out around the property. "Richard Voss, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, environmental terrorism, and federal racketeering charges. Drop your weapons and get on the ground immediately." For a moment, Daniel thought Richard Voss might actually fight, might order his bodyguards to start shooting and turn Maple Street into a war zone. But then the billionaire looked around at the overwhelming law enforcement presence at the cameras that were undoubtedly recording everything at his daughter's fierce, unrepentant face. "Stand down," he told his men quietly. "All of you stand down." The bodyguards lowered their weapons and stepped back, their hands visible as FBI agents moved in to secure the scene. Richard Voss straightened his tie and smoothed his hair, composing himself with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent a lifetime maintaining appearances under pressure. "Sophie," he said, his voice once again taking on that unsettling paternal tone. "You realize this isn't over, don't you? I have lawyers, connections, resources you can't even imagine. I'll be out on bail by morning, and this entire charade will be forgotten within a month." "Will it?" Sophie pulled out her phone again, showing him the screen where thousands of comments were scrolling past in real time. "Because it looks like your confession is already going viral. #Richard Voss. Murderer is trending on Twitter, and someone's already uploaded the video to YouTube." For the first time since he'd arrived, Richard Voss looked genuinely shaken. In the age of social media and instant global communication, even billionaires couldn't completely control the narrative once it escaped into the wild. "You have no idea what you've unleashed," he said quietly. "My business empire employs hundreds of thousands of people. My investments fund medical research, environmental cleanup projects, educational initiatives. Destroying me means destroying all of that." "Then maybe you should have thought about that before you decided to murder innocent people for profit," Sophie replied without a trace of sympathy. FBI agents were cuffing Richard Voss, now reading him his rights, while photographers and news crews arrived on scene. Daniel struggled to his feet with Sophie's help, his head still pounding, but his heart soaring with something that felt like vindication. "It's over," Sophie whispered, leaning against him for support. "It's actually over." "How did you know to start streaming?" Daniel asked. "I didn't, not really. But I knew my father well enough to know that he'd never resist the opportunity to gloat, to explain exactly how clever he'd been and how helpless we were to stop him." Sophie smiled grimly. "Narcissists can't help themselves. They always have to be the smartest person in the room, even when it destroys them." Agent Chen approached them, as the last of Richard Voss's bodyguards were led away in handcuffs. "Are you both all right? Do you need medical attention?" "I'm fine," Sophie said. "Daniel has a head injury that should probably be looked at." "Paramedics are on the way," Chen assured them. "Ms. Voss, I have to say that was either the bravest or the most reckless thing I've ever seen someone do during an active investigation." "Probably both," Sophie admitted. "But it worked." "It worked," Chen agreed. "Your father's confession is going to make prosecution a lot easier. Combined with the documentary evidence you provided, we should be able to put him away for the rest of his life." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Richard Voss called out from the back of the FBI vehicle where he was being held. "Sophie, This isn't over, sweetheart. I'll fight this with every resource at my disposal, and I'll make sure you pay for betraying your own family. Sophie walked over to the vehicle, her spine straight and her head held high. When she spoke, her voice was loud enough for the assembled crowd of law enforcement officers, reporters, and neighbors to hear clearly. You're not my family, Richard. You're a murderer who happens to share my DNA. My real family is here. She gestured toward Daniel. And they're the people who taught me that love is more important than money, that truth is more valuable than power, and that some things are worth fighting for no matter what the cost. Richard Voss's face contorted with rage and something that might have been grief. You'll regret this, Sophie. When you're living in poverty because I've cut off your trust fund, when you're facing federal charges for corporate espionage, when the whole world knows you as the daughter who destroyed her own father, you'll regret this. The only thing I regret, Sophie said quietly, is that it took me 3 years to find the courage to do the right thing. The FBI vehicle pulled away, taking Richard Voss toward what would likely be his last night of freedom for the rest of his life. Sophie stood in the street, watching until the taillights disappeared, her shoulders finally sagging with exhaustion and relief. It's really over, she said again, as if she couldn't quite believe it. Daniel wrapped his arms around her, holding her close as the circus of law enforcement and media continued around them. It's over. You did it, Sophie. You got justice for Maria for all of them. We did it, Sophie corrected. I couldn't have done this alone, Daniel. I needed you to give me the strength to see it through. What happens now? Sophie looked up at him, her eyes bright with tears and something that looked like hope. Now we build that life we talked about. A real life based on truth instead of lies. A family built on love instead of fear. Even if it means facing federal charges, even if your father was right about the legal consequences, even then. Sophie's smile was radiant, transforming her entire face. Daniel, I've spent 3 years living with the weight of my father's crimes. Whatever legal troubles I might face for exposing him, it's nothing compared to the freedom of finally telling the truth. As the paramedics arrived to check Daniel's head injury, and the last of the police cars cleared the scene, neighbors began emerging from their houses despite the late hour. Mrs. Patterson from next door, the Johnson family from across the street, even the elderly, Mr. Martinez from the corner house, all of them, drawn by curiosity and concern for the drama that had played out in their quiet neighborhood. Is everyone okay? Mrs. Patterson asked, wrapping a robe around herself against the October chill. We got evacuated hours ago because of some kind of gas leak, but then we saw all the police cars. There was no gas leak, Daniel said, accepting a blanket from one of the paramedics. That was just a cover story. But everyone's safe now. What was really happening? Asked Mr. Johnson, eyeing the lingering FBI agents with confusion. Sophie looked at Daniel, a question in her eyes. How much should they tell? How much were they ready to share with the world? The truth, Daniel said firmly. They deserved to know the truth about everything. And so, standing in the street where it had all come to an end, Sophie began to tell the story, not just of the past few hours, but of the past 3 years. She told them about Richard Voss and Voss Industries, about the water contamination that had killed 17 people, including Daniel's wife. She told them about the evidence she'd collected and the FBI investigation and the arrest that had just taken place before their eyes. By the time she finished, a crowd had gathered, neighbors and reporters and curious strangers drawn by the drama and the magnitude of the story. Sophie answered their questions with the same quiet courage she'd shown throughout the night, never flinching from the truth, no matter how painful or complicated it might be. "What's next for you?" asked a reporter with a news camera. "Now that your father's been arrested, what are your plans?" Sophie looked at Daniel, at the house where they'd found something like happiness together, at the life they were only just beginning to build. "I'm going home," she said simply. "To my real family. To the people who love me for who I am, not what I'm worth. And if you're prosecuted for corporate espionage, if you face federal charges for stealing your father's files, then I'll face them with the knowledge that I did the right thing. That 17 families finally got justice. That a murderer was held accountable for his crimes." Sophie's voice was steady, unwavering. "Some things are more important than personal safety. Truth is one of them." As the crowd finally began to disperse, and the last of the news crews packed up their equipment, Daniel and Sophie found themselves alone on their front porch. The October night was peaceful now, the crisis past, the truth finally exposed to the light. "Are you sure about this?" Daniel asked, taking her hand. "About staying, about facing whatever comes next together?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Sophie replied. "Daniel, for 3 years I've been living a lie, pretending to be someone I wasn't, carrying secrets that were eating me alive. Tonight, for the first time since I was 17 years old, I feel like I can breathe again. Even though your father will probably try to destroy us both. He can try. But he can't take away what we have, what we've built together. He can't change the fact that we love each other, that we're a family." Sophie squeezed his hand. "And besides, he's going to be a little too busy with federal prosecutors to worry about revenge." Daniel laughed, surprising himself with the sound. After everything they'd been through, after all the fear and danger and uncertainty, he was actually laughing. "What's so funny? I was just thinking about Lila," Daniel said. "About how excited she's going to be when she finds out that Sophie, her Sophie, is the one who caught the bad guy who hurt Mommy." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "You think she'll forgive me for lying to her about who I was? Sophie, that little girl loves you like a sister. She's going to think you're the bravest, most amazing person in the world." Daniel pulled her closer, holding her against his chest, where he could feel her heart beating strong and steady. "We all do." "I love you," Sophie whispered against his shoulder. "I love you and Lila, and this house and this life we're building together. I love it more than I ever loved money or comfort or the security of being Richard Voss's daughter." "I love you too," Daniel replied. "All of you, the scared young woman who knocked on my door asking for a room to rent, the brave whistleblower who risked everything for justice, the woman who taught my daughter to fold origami cranes and helped her believe in wishes again." They stood there on the porch for a long time, holding each other and watching the sun begin to rise over Maple Street. Somewhere in the distance, Daniel could hear the sound of traffic beginning to pick up as the city woke to news of Richard Voss's arrest. The story would dominate headlines for weeks, maybe months. There would be trials and investigations and endless media attention. But for now, in this moment, there was just peace. The kind of peace that comes from finally telling the truth, from finally standing up to the monsters that had haunted their lives for so long. "What do you think happens next?" Sophie asked. Daniel looked at her, at this remarkable woman who had given up everything to seek justice for people she'd never met, who had chosen love over loyalty and truth over comfort. "Next," he said, "we call Lila and tell her she can come home. Next, we start planning the rest of our lives together. Next, we prove that sometimes if you're brave enough to fight for what's right, good really can triumph over evil." Sophie smiled, and in that smile Daniel saw their entire future, messy and complicated, and probably difficult but real, in a way that nothing in either of their lives had been real before. "I like the sound of that," she said. As the morning sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, Daniel Cole and Sophie Voss stood together on the porch of 247 Maple Street, no longer running from the past, but walking hand in hand toward a future built on truth, justice, and the unshakable foundation of love. The war against Richard Voss was over. Now finally, they could begin to live. 6 months later, Daniel stood in the witness box of the Federal District Court in Seattle, his hand still raised from taking the oath, staring across the packed courtroom at Richard Voss. The billionaire sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit that seemed to diminish him, his once commanding presence reduced to something almost pathetic. The months in federal custody awaiting trial had aged him dramatically. His hair had gone completely gray, his face was gaunt, and the arrogant confidence that had once made him seem larger than life had been replaced by the hollow look of a man who finally understood that his money couldn't buy his way out of everything. "Mr. Cole," the federal prosecutor said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "Can you tell the jury about the night of March 15th, 2019, when your wife first became ill?" Daniel took a deep breath, his eyes finding Sophie in the gallery. She sat in the front row, directly behind the prosecution table, Lila beside her, holding a folder of drawings she'd made for the good lawyers who are helping catch the bad man. Sophie nodded encouragingly, and Daniel felt his courage strengthen. Maria had been feeling tired for weeks. Daniel began, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "We thought it was just stress from work, maybe a vitamin deficiency. But that night she collapsed in our kitchen while making dinner for Lila." The prosecutor guided him through the timeline. The emergency room visits, the misdiagnoses, the months of declining health before anyone thought to test the water supply. Daniel had told this story dozens of times to investigators, grand juries, and deposition hearings, but it never got easier. The difference now was that he was telling it with purpose, with the knowledge that finally, someone was listening who had the power to hold Richard Voss accountable. "Did you ever suspect that your home's water supply might be contaminated?" the prosecutor asked. "Never. The city sent out notices every year saying the water met all safety standards. We had no reason to doubt that." Daniel's voice hardened. "We didn't know that Voss Industries had been bribing city officials to falsify those reports for over a decade." "Objection." The defense attorney shot to his feet. "That allegation was never proven in this proceeding." "Sustained," the judge ruled, but Daniel could see the jury's faces. They'd been following the case for weeks now, listening to testimony and reviewing evidence. They knew exactly what Richard Voss had done, even if the technical legal language couldn't capture the full scope of his crimes. The cross-examination was brutal. Richard Voss's defense team had cost him $20 million so far, and they were earning every penny by trying to discredit Daniel's testimony, questioning his memory, suggesting that his wife's illness might have had other causes. But Daniel had been preparing for this moment for months, and every time they tried to shake his story, he responded with the quiet dignity of a man who had lived through hell and emerged with his integrity intact. "Mr. Cole," the lead defense attorney said, pacing in front of the witness box, "isn't it true that you're being financially compensated for your testimony, that the FBI has promised you a substantial reward for cooperating with this prosecution?" "No, that's not true," Daniel replied firmly. "I'm not being paid anything for my testimony. The only money I've received was the settlement from the civil lawsuit, which was awarded to all the families affected by the contamination." A settlement of $2 million per family, correct money that came directly from my client's personal assets. Daniel felt a flash of anger at the lawyer's tone, as if the money somehow made Richard Voss a victim rather than a perpetrator. "Money that should have been paid years ago when my wife first got sick. Money that might have saved her life if your client had disclosed the contamination instead of covering it up. But you did receive $2 million. a significant financial benefit from pursuing this prosecution. "Sir," Daniel said, his voice rising slightly, "no amount of money could ever compensate for losing my wife. If I could give back every penny to have Maria alive and healthy, I'd do it without hesitation. This trial isn't about money. It's about justice." The defense attorney tried several more approaches, but Daniel could see that his testimony was having an impact on the jury. These were ordinary people, teachers, mechanics, nurses, retirees, who understood the difference between seeking justice and seeking profit. They could see the genuine grief in Daniel's eyes when he talked about Maria, and they could see the cold calculation in Richard Voss's face as he watched the proceedings unfold. When Daniel finally stepped down from the witness stand, he felt drained but victorious. He told Maria's story to the people who would decide Richard Voss's fate, and he'd done it with honesty and dignity. Whatever happened next, he'd kept his promise to her memory. Sophie was waiting for him in the hallway outside the courtroom, Lila bouncing excitedly beside her. "Daddy, you were so brave," Lila announced, throwing her arms around his waist. "Sophie says you told the truth even when the mean lawyer was trying to confuse you." "That's what we do in this family," Daniel said, scooping his daughter up for a hug. "We tell the truth even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard," Sophie added, slipping her hand into his. Over the past 6 months, their relationship had deepened and strengthened through the shared trial of the legal proceedings. The media attention had been intense, reporters camping outside their house, photographers following them to the grocery store, endless requests for interviews and exclusive stories. But they'd weathered it together, protecting Lila as much as possible, while never backing down from their commitment to see justice done. "How do you think it went?" Sophie asked as they walked toward the elevator. "Better than I hoped. The jury was listening, really listening. And when that defense attorney tried to make it about the money," Daniel shook his head. "I think he just made himself look callous. Mr. Voss looked scared," Lila observed with the brutal honesty of childhood. "Like when I broke Mommy's vase and knew I was going to get in trouble, except worse." Sophie and Daniel exchanged glances over Lila's head. The 8-year-old had been remarkably resilient throughout the trial proceedings, but she'd also absorbed more about the case than either adult was entirely comfortable with. They'd tried to shield her from the worst details, but it was impossible to completely protect her from the reality that her new family was at the center of one of the biggest criminal trials in recent memory. "Sophie, when is your turn to talk to the jury?" Lila asked as they reached their car. "Tomorrow morning, sweetheart," Sophie replied, and Daniel heard the nervousness in her voice despite her efforts to sound calm. Sophie's testimony was going to be the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. She was the star witness, the insider who could provide first-hand evidence of Richard Voss's knowledge and intent. But she was also the defendant's daughter, which the defense team would undoubtedly try to use against her. They'd already filed motions claiming that Sophie was an unreliable witness, motivated by personal vendetta rather than concern for justice. "Are you ready?" Daniel asked as they drove home through the Seattle traffic. "I think so. I've been preparing for this moment for 3 years, really. But knowing I'm going to have to sit in that courtroom and publicly accuse my own father of murder..." Sophie shook her head. "It doesn't matter that he's guilty. It doesn't matter that he deserves everything that's coming to him. It still feels like I'm betraying some fundamental law of nature." "You're not betraying anything," Daniel said firmly. "You're honoring the memory of 17 people who died because of his greed. You're protecting future victims who might suffer if he's allowed to continue operating. You're choosing justice over family loyalty, and that takes more courage than most people possess." That evening, after Lila was asleep, Daniel and Sophie sat on their back porch, reviewing Sophie's testimony one final time. The October air was crisp with the promise of winter, but Maria's roses were still blooming, a final burst of color, before the frost claimed them. Agent Chen had told them that the prosecution felt confident about their case, but Daniel knew that confidence meant nothing until the jury delivered their verdict. "What if they don't believe me?" Sophie asked quietly. "What if the defense convinces them that I'm just a vengeful daughter trying to destroy her father out of spite? Then we'll appeal. We'll keep fighting until someone listens." Daniel reached for her hand, squeezing gently. "Sophie, you've already won the most important battle. The truth is out there now in the public record, preserved forever. Even if your father somehow escapes criminal conviction, his reputation is destroyed. His business empire is in ruins. He'll never hurt another innocent person the way he hurt Maria and the others. Is that enough? Is destroying his legacy enough if he doesn't actually go to prison?" Daniel considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, he would have said that nothing short of a life sentence could provide adequate justice for Richard Voss's crimes. But the past half year had taught him something about the nature of victory and revenge. The real triumph wasn't just in seeing Richard Voss punished, it was in the life that Daniel and Sophie had built together, the family they'd created from the ashes of tragedy and betrayal. "It's enough," he said finally, "because we won the moment you decided to expose him. We won the moment you chose love over money, truth over comfort. Everything else is just legal formalities." Sophie nodded, but Daniel could see the tension still radiating from her shoulders. Tomorrow would be the hardest day of her life, and they both knew it. "I have something for you," Daniel said, reaching into his jacket pocket. "Something I've been saving for the right moment." He pulled out a small velvet box, watching Sophie's eyes widen as she recognized what it was. "Daniel, you don't have to. I want to," he interrupted, opening the box to reveal a simple but elegant engagement ring. "Sophie Voss, you are the bravest, most selfless person I've ever known. You've brought light back into my life and Lila's life in ways I never thought possible. You've shown us what it means to fight for justice, to choose what's right over what's easy. Will you marry me?" Sophie stared at the ring, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Are you sure, even knowing that marrying me means you'll always be connected to this scandal, to my father's crimes? Especially knowing that. Because marrying you means I get to spend the rest of my life with someone who has the courage to stand up to evil no matter what it costs." Daniel slipped off the porch swing and knelt beside her chair. "Sophie, you're not just the woman I love. You're the person I want to be like when I grow up. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Sophie whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, of course, yes." As Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger, both of them crying and laughing at the same time, Lila's voice drifted down from her bedroom window. "Sophie's going to be my real mom now," she announced to the neighborhood at large. "Daddy, can we have the wedding in the backyard with all the roses?" The next morning, Sophie took the witness stand wearing the engagement ring and a simple blue dress that made her look young and vulnerable despite everything she'd been through. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching on closed-circuit television in adjacent rooms. The media attention was intense. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, when Richard Voss's own daughter would testify against him. The prosecution led Sophie through her story, methodically building a timeline of discovery and betrayal that left the jury visibly shaken. She described finding the first evidence of the cover-up, her father's violent reaction when she questioned him about it, the 3 years of careful planning and evidence gathering that had led to this moment. "Ms. Voss," the prosecutor said, "can you tell the jury about the document marked as Exhibit 47? Sophie looked at the screen where an email chain was displayed, her father's name clearly visible in the sender field. This is an internal company email from my father to his senior executives, dated 6 months before the Raven Lake contamination was publicly disclosed. Sophie said, her voice steady and clear. In it, he specifically states that environmental testing has revealed dangerous levels of industrial toxins in the local water supply, but that disclosing this information would result in, quote, catastrophic financial liability that could destroy the company's quarterly projections. And what does he recommend in this email? Sophie's voice hardened. He recommends continuing operations while quietly transferring assets to offshore accounts in preparation for what he calls inevitable litigation from affected parties. Did your father know that people were getting sick from the contaminated water? Yes. The email includes an attachment with medical reports showing unusually high rates of cancer and autoimmune disorders in the Raven Lake area going back 3 years before the public disclosure. And despite this knowledge, he chose to continue the contamination. He chose to accelerate it. The email specifically mentions increasing production quotas at the facility responsible for the contamination because he knew it would be shut down eventually, and he wanted to maximize profits before that happened. The courtroom was dead silent as the full implications of Sophie's testimony sank in. This wasn't just corporate negligence or environmental carelessness. This was premeditated murder for profit. The cross-examination was vicious. Richard Voss's defense team attacked Sophie's credibility, her motives, even her mental health. They suggested that she'd fabricated evidence out of resentment over her father's strict parenting. They claimed that she'd been manipulated by Daniel and the FBI into betraying her own family. They painted her as an unstable young woman seeking attention and revenge. But Sophie weathered every attack with quiet dignity, responding to each accusation with calm, factual answers that only reinforced her credibility. When the defense attorney suggested that she'd stolen the documents out of spite, she replied that she'd stolen them to prevent future murders. When they claimed she was motivated by a desire for media attention, she pointed out that she'd spent 3 years trying to avoid any public exposure whatsoever. Ms. Voss, the defense attorney said during his final line of questioning, you realize that your testimony here today will likely result in your father spending the rest of his life in prison. Yes, I realize that. And you're comfortable with that outcome. Sophie looked across the courtroom at her father, meeting his eyes directly for the first time during the trial. Richard Voss stared back at her with a mixture of rage and something that might have been heartbreak. I'm comfortable with justice being served, Sophie said quietly. I'm comfortable knowing that no other family will suffer the way the Coles suffered, the way the other 16 families suffered. I'm comfortable knowing that my father will finally be held accountable for his actions, even though it means destroying your own family. Sophie's smile was sad but resolute. My family is sitting right there, she said, gesturing toward Daniel and Lila in the gallery. The people who love me for who I am, not what I'm worth. The people who taught me that some things are more important than money or blood relations. My real family understands that justice matters more than loyalty. When Sophie finally stepped down from the witness stand, the prosecution rested its case. The defense presented their arguments over the next 3 days, but it was clear that Sophie's testimony had been devastating. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning with their verdict. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. The words rang through the packed courtroom like a bell tolling. Daniel felt Sophie's hand squeeze his as they listened to the jury foreman read verdict after verdict guilty on all 37 counts, including environmental terrorism, racketeering, conspiracy, and multiple counts of murder. Richard Voss showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, but Daniel could see his hands shaking slightly as the bailiff placed him in handcuffs. The man who had once commanded a billion-dollar empire with absolute authority was now just another convicted felon facing life in prison. "Mr. Voss," the judge said, "you will be remanded to federal custody pending sentencing. Given the serious nature of these crimes and your substantial financial resources, bail is denied." As Richard Voss was led away, he turned one final time to look at Sophie. For a moment, his composure cracked, and Daniel saw not the ruthless billionaire who had murdered 17 people, but a broken old man who had lost everything, including his daughter's love. "Sophie," Richard Voss called out, as the bailiff guided him toward the door. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, sweetheart." Sophie stood up in the gallery, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry too, Father. I'm sorry it had to end this way." Then he was gone, disappeared through the courtroom doors, to begin what would likely be the rest of his life behind bars. The sentencing hearing took place 3 weeks later. Daniel, Sophie, and Lila sat in the front row as victim after victim took the stand to describe how Richard Voss's crimes had destroyed their lives. Maria's sister flew in from Portland to read a statement about the niece she'd never see grow up. The widow of another victim described watching her husband die slowly from cancer while their insurance company denied treatment claims. A father talked about burying his teenage daughter, a promising artist whose life had been cut short by contaminated drinking water. Through it all, Richard Voss sat motionless at the defense table, his face a mask of resignation. The man who had once believed he was above the law, untouchable because of his wealth and connections, now understood that justice had finally caught up with him. "Mr. Voss," the judge said when the victim impact statements were complete, "you have been convicted of 37 felony counts, including 17 counts of first-degree murder. The evidence presented at trial shows that you knowingly and willfully poisoned a community's water supply for financial gain, and that you actively covered up your crimes for years, while innocent people suffered and died." The judge paused, studying Richard Voss, with the kind of contempt usually reserved for the worst criminals. "In my 30 years on the bench, I have never seen such a callous disregard for human life. You had every opportunity to prevent these deaths, to clean up the contamination, to warn the affected communities. Instead, you chose to maximize profits while people died. The only appropriate sentence for crimes of this magnitude is life in prison without the possibility of parole." The gavel came down with finality, and suddenly it was over. Richard Voss was led away to begin his life sentence, and Daniel felt a weight he'd been carrying for 4 years finally lift from his shoulders. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed around them, shouting questions and pushing microphones toward their faces. But Daniel only had eyes for Sophie, who stood beside him, looking simultaneously relieved and devastated. "How do you feel about your father's sentence?" a reporter called out. Sophie composed herself, straightening her shoulders in the gesture Daniel had come to recognize as her preparing to face the world with truth rather than comfortable lies. "I feel that justice has been served," she said clearly. 17 families finally have closure. My father will never hurt anyone again. That's what matters. "Do you regret exposing your own father?" "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that my father chose money over human life. But I don't regret standing up for what was right." Sophie reached for Daniel's hand, drawing strength from his presence. "Some things are more important than family loyalty. Truth is one of them. Justice is another. What's next for you and Mr. Cole?" Sophie looked at Daniel, then down at Lila, who was holding both their hands and beaming up at the cameras with the fearless confidence of a child who had watched the adults in her life fight for justice and win. "We're going home," Sophie said simply, "to start the rest of our lives." The wedding took place 6 months later in the backyard of 247 Maple Street, surrounded by Maria's roses and the paper cranes that Sophie and Lila had been folding steadily since that first night. They'd reached their goal of 1,000 cranes weeks earlier, but they'd kept folding anyway, creating chains of colorful birds that decorated every surface of the garden. Agent Chen officiated the ceremony, having been ordained online specifically for the occasion. The guest list was small but meaningful. Daniel's sister and her family from Portland, a few close friends from the neighborhood, and several of the other Raven Lake families, who had become like extended family through their shared ordeal. "Do you, Sophie Voss, take Daniel Cole to be your husband?" Agent Chen asked, struggling to maintain her professional composure despite the emotion of the moment. "I do," Sophie said, her voice clear and strong. "I promise to love you and Lila, to build a life based on truth and justice, and to never again let fear prevent me from doing what's right." "And do you, Daniel Cole, take Sophie Voss to be your wife?" "I do," Daniel replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise to love and protect you both, to honor Maria's memory, by building something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy, and to always remember that some battles are worth fighting no matter what they cost." As they exchanged rings, Lila served as ring bearer, her face glowing with happiness. She'd been planning this wedding for months, designing programs and decorations with the artistic flair she'd inherited from her mother, and the determined optimism she'd learned from watching the adults in her life refuse to give up on justice. "By the power vested in me by the state of Washington and the Internet," Agent Chen said with a smile, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Daniel kissed Sophie as their friends and family cheered, and in that moment, surrounded by the people they loved in the garden, where Maria's roses bloomed eternal, he felt a completeness he'd never thought he'd experience again. Later, as the reception wound down and the last guests departed, Daniel found himself standing in the kitchen, where it had all begun. This was the room where Sophie had first cooked for them, where they'd folded origami cranes and talked about wishes and dreams. This was where he'd confronted her about her real identity, where they'd planned the downfall of a billionaire, where they'd fallen in love despite the impossible circumstances that had brought them together. "Penny for your thoughts," Sophie said, slipping her arms around his waist from behind. "Just thinking about how far we've come. A year ago, I thought my life was over. I thought the best I could hope for was to raise Lila and maybe find some peace with Maria's death. I never imagined that you'd end up married to the daughter of your wife's killer." Daniel turned in her arms, studying her face in the soft light of the kitchen. "That I'd end up married to the most courageous woman I've ever known. That I'd get a second chance at happiness. That justice would actually prevail for once." Sophie smiled, the expression transforming her entire face. Over the past year, she'd gained weight and color, losing the haunted look that had marked her features when she first arrived at his door. She looked healthy now, happy like someone who had finally found her place in the world. "What are you thinking about?" Daniel asked. "About Lila's wish. The one she made when we finished folding 1,000 cranes. What did she wish for?" "She told me later. She wished for our family to always be together, always be happy, and always be brave enough to do the right thing." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "I think her wish came true." "It did. And you know what, I think Maria would be proud of all of us. Proud of you for having the courage to expose your father. Proud of me for finally getting justice for her death. Proud of Lila for being strong and resilient through everything." "Do you really think so?" "I know so. Maria always said that love was the most powerful force in the universe, that it could overcome any obstacle if people were brave enough to fight for it. Daniel pulled Sophie closer, holding her against his chest, where he could feel her heart beating strong and steady. She was right. From upstairs came the sound of Lila's voice, probably talking to her stuffed animals about the wedding and all the excitement of the day. Soon they'd need to go tuck her in to read her a bedtime story and listen to her recount every detail of becoming a family in the eyes of the law as well as in their hearts. But for now, they stood together in the kitchen that had witnessed so much pain and joy, so much deception and truth, so much fear and love. The origami cranes hanging from the ceiling stirred gently in the breeze from the open window, their paper wings catching the light, like promises of hope fulfilled. Richard Voss was in federal prison serving a life sentence for his crimes. The families of his victims had received justice and financial compensation. Environmental regulations had been strengthened to prevent similar tragedies. Sophie's testimony had sparked a nationwide conversation about corporate accountability and the true cost of putting profits before people. But more than that, something beautiful had grown from the ashes of tragedy. 3 people who had been broken by loss and betrayal had found each other and built something new, something stronger than what they'd lost. They'd created a family based on choice rather than blood on love, rather than obligation on truth, rather than comfortable lies. "Mrs. Cole," Daniel said, testing out Sophie's new name. "I like the sound of that," Sophie replied, standing on her tiptoes to kiss him. "Mrs. Sophie Cole, wife and mother and artist, and the woman who helped bring down a billionaire. Don't forget whistleblower and environmental hero and the bravest person I've ever known." "All of that," Sophie agreed, "but mostly just happy. For the first time in my life, I'm completely, utterly happy." As they finally headed upstairs to tuck Lila into bed and begin their first night as a legally married family, Daniel carried with him the knowledge that sometimes, if you're brave enough to fight for what's right, the good guys really do win. Sometimes justice prevails. Sometimes love conquers all. And sometimes when you think your story is over, it's really just beginning. 3 years later, Daniel stood in the backyard of their expanded house watching Sophie teach art classes to a group of local children. She'd used her settlement money from the Voss Industries lawsuit to start a non-profit foundation focused on environmental education and corporate accountability. The Foundation for Environmental Truth, as it was called, provided legal aid to communities affected by industrial pollution and funded research into corporate environmental crimes. "Daddy, look what I made." Lila, now 11, and even more artistic than ever, came running up with a painting of their house surrounded by paper cranes. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. Is that for Sophie's gallery showing next week?" "Uh-huh. Sophie says my art tells important stories about family and love and fighting for what's right." Lila beamed with pride. "She says I'm going to be a famous artist someday, just like Mommy wanted to be." Daniel ruffled his daughter's hair, marveling at how she'd grown and thrived over the past 3 years. The trauma of her early childhood had been healed by the love and stability Sophie had brought to their lives. She remembered Maria with love rather than sadness now, and she'd embraced Sophie not as a replacement mother, but as an addition to their family, someone who honored Maria's memory while creating new traditions and possibilities. "Mr. Cole," a young woman approached them, notebook in hand. "I'm Sarah Martinez from the Seattle Times. I was wondering if I could ask you a few questions about the 3-year anniversary of Richard Voss's conviction." Daniel glanced at Sophie, who was still teaching her art class, but had noticed the reporter's arrival. They'd agreed to do one interview to mark the anniversary, to remind people that corporate accountability remained an ongoing issue. "Of course," Daniel said. "What would you like to know?" How has your life changed since the trial? Do you feel that justice was truly served? Daniel considered the question, looking around at the scene before him. Sophie was helping a 6-year-old girl paint a picture of a butterfly, her face glowing with the kind of contentment that came from meaningful work. Lila was showing her painting to the other children, explaining with passionate gestures how art could tell stories about courage and truth. In the garden, Maria's roses bloomed beside new plantings that Sophie had added a memorial garden for all the victims of corporate environmental crimes. Justice was served in the legal sense, Daniel said carefully. Richard Voss is in prison where he belongs, and that brings closure to the families he harmed. But real justice is what we've built here, a life dedicated to preventing similar tragedies, to supporting other families facing corporate wrongdoing, to raising awareness about environmental crimes. And your marriage to Sophie Voss. Some critics have suggested that it's inappropriate for a victim to marry the perpetrator's daughter. Daniel felt his jaw tighten. Even 3 years later, there were people who couldn't understand how love could grow from such tragic circumstances. Sophie isn't responsible for her father's crimes, Daniel said firmly. She's the woman who risked everything to expose those crimes, who chose justice over family loyalty, who spent the past 3 years working to make sure nothing like this happens again. She's my wife Lila's mother, and one of the most ethical people I've ever known. Anyone who has a problem with our marriage doesn't understand what real courage looks like. The reporter scribbled notes, clearly hoping to foment some hint of scandal or controversy. But there wasn't any. Daniel and Sophie's marriage was built on a foundation of shared values and mutual respect, strengthened by the trials they'd faced together and deepened by their commitment to using their experience to help others. What about Richard Voss? Have you had any contact with him since his sentencing? No, and we don't plan to. Sophie sent him a letter when Lila won her first art contest, letting him know that his granddaughter was thriving despite his attempts to destroy our family. But other than that, he's part of our past, not our future. That evening after the art class ended, and the children went home clutching their paintings, Daniel and Sophie sat on their back porch with glasses of wine, watching Lila play with the neighbor children in the gathering dusk. The reporter asked about Richard, Daniel said. Sophie's hand tightened slightly on her wine glass, but her expression remained calm. What did you tell her? That he's part of our past, not our future. Good. That's exactly right. Sophie leaned back in her chair, studying the memorial garden, where 17 rose bushes bloomed in honor of the 17 victims. I got a letter from his prison chaplain last week. He wanted me to know that my father has been attending religious services, that he claims to have found redemption. How do you feel about that? Sophie was quiet for a long moment, considering her answer. I hope it's true. I hope he's found some kind of peace, some way to live with what he's done. But redemption doesn't erase consequences. It doesn't bring back the people he killed or undo the pain he caused. If he's truly remorseful, then he'll accept his punishment and use whatever time he has left to reflect on his choices. Do you miss him, miss having a father? I miss the father I thought he was when I was little, before I understood what kind of man he really was. But I don't miss the man who chose money over human life, who threatened to kill you and Lila to protect his secrets. Sophie reached for Daniel's hand. Besides, I have a real family now. People who love me unconditionally, who support my choices even when they're difficult, who've shown me what it means to be truly happy. As if summoned by their conversation, Lila came running up to the porch, grass stains on her knees, and happiness radiating from every inch of her small frame. Sophie, can we make more cranes tonight? I want to fold 1,000 for my art show next week so people can make wishes for the environment and for stopping bad companies from hurting people. Of course we can, sweetheart. That's a beautiful idea. As they headed inside to begin another marathon crane-folding session, Daniel reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. 4 years ago, he'd been a broken man drowning in grief and helplessness, unable to imagine a future beyond simple survival. Now he was part of a thriving family, dedicated to fighting injustice and creating beauty in the world. The doorbell rang just as they were setting up their origami supplies on the kitchen table. Daniel opened it to find Agent Chen standing on their front porch, a bottle of champagne in her hands and a broad smile on her face. "Sarah, what brings you by is good news," she said, stepping into the house and accepting Lila's enthusiastic hug. "I wanted to tell you in person before it hits the news tomorrow. The Department of Justice is announcing a new environmental crimes task force specifically designed to investigate and prosecute cases like Richard Voss's. They're calling it the Maria Cole Initiative." Daniel felt his breath catch. "They're naming it after Maria." The Attorney General felt that her story embodied everything the task force was designed to prevent innocent people dying because of corporate greed and government negligence. "Your wife's legacy is going to help protect countless future victims." Sophie wiped tears from her eyes as she processed the news. Maria would be so proud. She always believed that one person could make a difference if they were brave enough to try. "She was right," Agent Chen said. "And so were both of you. Your courage in exposing Richard Voss has led to major policy changes, stricter environmental regulations, and now this task force. You've quite literally saved lives." They celebrated with champagne and sparkling cider toasting Maria's memory, and the knowledge that her death had ultimately led to protections that would prevent similar tragedies. As the evening wore on and Agent Chen prepared to leave, she pulled Daniel aside for a private conversation. "There's something else I wanted to tell you," she said quietly. "Something that's not going public yet. We've been investigating other companies using the evidence and techniques Sophie helped us develop. We've identified at least 6 other corporations that may be engaged in similar cover-ups. The ripple effects of your case are just beginning." Daniel felt a surge of satisfaction mixed with sadness. 6 more companies meant potentially hundreds more victims, but it also meant that Richard Voss's exposure was continuing to save lives even 3 years later. "Sophie should know about this," Daniel said. "She's considering expanding the Foundation's scope to include investigation and research." "I was hoping you'd say that. We could use her expertise, her understanding of how these corporate conspiracies work from the inside." Agent Chen smiled. "She's become something of a legend in law enforcement circles, you know. The woman who brought down her own father to protect innocent people." After Agent Chesterton left, Daniel found Sophie in Lila's room reading a bedtime story about a brave princess who saved her kingdom by telling the truth even when it was dangerous. Lila was curled up under her covers, listening with the intense focus she brought to all stories about courage and justice. "And the princess lived happily ever after," Sophie concluded, "not because she was rich or powerful, but because she chose to do what was right." "Just like you did, Sophie," Lila said sleepily. "You were brave like the princess, and now we all get to live happily ever after." "That's right, sweetheart. Sometimes being brave means facing scary things, but it's always worth it when you're fighting for the people you love." After Lila fell asleep, Daniel and Sophie retired to their own bedroom, where they could finally process the day's events in private. "The Maria Cole Initiative," Sophie said, testing the words. "I think Maria would love that her name is going to help protect other families." "She would. And she'd be amazed by everything you've accomplished, everything you've built from the wreckage of her death." Daniel pulled Sophie into his arms, marveling once again at how perfectly she fit against him. "Have I told you lately that you're the most remarkable woman I've ever known?" "Only every day," Sophie replied with a smile. But I never get tired of hearing it. Good, because I plan to keep saying it for the next 50 years or so. They lay in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of their neighborhood settling into sleep. Through their bedroom window, Daniel could see the memorial garden, where 17 rose bushes stood sentinel in the moonlight, eternal reminders of the lives lost and the justice finally served. Daniel, Sophie said quietly, do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't knocked on your door that night? If I'd rented a room somewhere else or found a different way to investigate my father? Every day, Daniel admitted. And every day I'm grateful that you did knock on our door. Not just because it led to justice for Maria, but because it led to you becoming part of our family. Do you think she knows Maria, I mean? Do you think she knows how things turned out? Daniel considered the question, thinking about the wife he'd loved, and lost the woman whose death had seemed so senseless until Sophie had revealed the truth behind it. I think she knows. I think she's proud of all of us, proud of you for having the courage to expose your father, proud of me for finding love again, proud of Lila for growing up strong and kind, despite everything she's been through. Daniel pulled Sophie closer. I think she knows that her death wasn't meaningless, that it led to something beautiful and important. I love you, Sophie whispered against his chest. I love you and Lila, and this life we've built together. I love knowing that we've made a difference, that other families won't have to suffer the way you suffered. I love you too, more than I ever thought possible. As they drifted off to sleep in each other's arms, Daniel reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had been a long road from that terrible night, when Maria first became ill, through the dark years of grief and helplessness, to the moment when Sophie had appeared at his door carrying secrets that would change everything. There had been pain and fear, and moments when the cost of seeking justice seemed too high to bear. But there had also been love and courage and the gradual understanding that some battles are worth fighting regardless of the personal cost. Now finally, they had arrived at something like peace. Not the brittle peace of resignation or avoidance, but the deep, lasting peace that comes from knowing you've fought for what's right and won. The peace that comes from building something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. The peace that comes from understanding that love really can conquer all if you're brave enough to fight for it. In the morning, they would wake up and continue their work running the foundation, raising Lila, fighting for environmental justice and corporate accountability. There would be new challenges and new victories, new families to help, and new criminals to expose. But tonight, they slept peacefully in the house where it all began, surrounded by the love they'd chosen, and the family they'd built, protected by the knowledge that Maria's legacy lived on in every life they saved and every truth they revealed. And in the memorial garden outside their window, 17 rose bushes bloomed eternal in the moonlight, silent witnesses to the power of love, the inevitability of justice, and the unshakable truth that sometimes when you're brave enough to do what's right, happy endings really do come true. The story of Daniel Cole and Sophie Voss was complete, but their legacy would continue for generations in the lives they'd saved, the policies they'd changed, and the daughter they were raising to believe that one person really could make a difference in the world. Love had conquered greed. Truth had defeated deception. Justice had finally inevitably prevailed, and they all lived not just happily, but meaningfully ever after.